Above his head, the gray sky was shrouded in smog, and the edge of the concrete awning had a crack running down the middle. His body wouldn't obey him, not like after waking from sleep, but as if it belonged to someone else, like a suit worn inside out. He tried to raise his arm, and it rose, but with a half-second delay, as if the signal were traveling through a poor connection. His fingers were long. The calluses weren't from a scalpel or a bone cleaning brush. They were from a pencil. This man had written a lot, or drawn. Moon Tae Rin sat down, and the world swayed. Before him was a plaza at the entrance to the underground complex. Third rate, judging by the peeling paint on the security posts and the fact that the guard at the entrance didn't even glance in his direction. A backpack lay on a nearby bench, worn, with a patch shaped like a stream. Tae Rin looked at his hands again. Skinny wrists, scars on his knuckles, veins standing out too clearly. This body hadn't been fed properly. He turned his palms upward, and out of a habit this body couldn't possibly have, began to read. The radius is thin. Calcium deficiency during adolescence. The elbow joint developed unevenly. Right-handed, but the left hand was trained by force. Someone tried to turn this guy into a fighter, and it didn't work out. He found a notice in his jacket pocket, a debt for the clan's dormitory. The amount was laughable by any world's standards, but apparently insurmountable for an E rank. Below was a handwritten note. Tomorrow is the last day. The handwriting was neat. The same person who'd left calluses from the pencil. Tae Rin folded the paper and put it back. A group walked by, 4 of them. Their armor gleamed. Good weapons, B rank or thereabouts. One of them glanced at Tae Rin and snorted. He turned to his companions and said loudly enough for the corpse still sitting on the bench to hear. The others laughed. Tae Rin raised his head. He looked at the speaker for a long time, calmly, with the kind of gaze that those accustomed to working with the dead cast upon the living. The speaker stumbled mid-sentence. He didn't understand why he'd stumbled. Tae Rin replied quietly. He said not yet. The group left. The laughter died down faster than it should have. Tae Rin opened his backpack. Inside, he found a change of underwear, an expired energy bar, and a notebook. The notebook was half filled with writing, in the same neat handwriting. The entries were strange, not a diary. More like observations. Dates of hunters' disappearances, guild report numbers, question marks in the margins. This guy was looking for something, or someone. Tae Rin flipped to a blank page. He pulled a pencil stub out of his pocket. He wrote at the top, Day 1. Inventory. Below, he began a list. Body, male, approximately 23 years old, height about 178, underweight, chronic malnutrition. Scars on the back, unprotected training fights, weak core muscles, irregular heartbeat. Conclusion, the previous owner didn't take care of himself, or no one took care of him. He stopped. The previous owner. The words flowed onto the paper easily. Too easily, as if he had already accepted that this was someone else's body. That his own body lay somewhere on an icy staircase near a Chicago subway station. That the last thing he thought about before dying was unidentified body number 47 and an unfinished conclusion. A boy? He closed the notebook. He stood up. His legs were wobbly, but held him up. The security guard at the entrance to the underground finally looked at him. He asked lazily where he was headed. Tae Rin replied that he wasn't going anywhere. Not yet, anyway. He turned around and walked toward the city. He needed to figure out 3 things: where he was, who he was here, and why the previous owner of this body had kept records that looked more like investigative files than the diary of an E-rank hunter's diary. The city turned out to be Seoul, but not the Seoul he knew from childhood trips with his parents. The Seoul was laid out differently. Every few blocks stood defensive pillars with flickering runes. At the intersections hung display boards with information about the nearest dungeons. Rank, status, time, until closing. People walked by without paying any attention. To them, it was as normal as traffic lights. Tae Rin stopped in front of a store window. A stranger stared back at him in the reflection. A gaunt face, dark circles under the eyes, cheekbones too sharp. But the eyes were different. Those eyes were already his. He walked on. He found the clan's dormitory at the address listed on the notice, a 3-story building in an old neighborhood. The plaster was peeling. A sign with Chinese characters. The Quiet Stream Clan. Inside, it smelled of boiled rice and something medicinal. 3 people were sitting in the common room on the first floor, 2 young men and an old man with a red face and cloudy eyes. The old man looked at Tae Rin and muttered something about how they were expecting him at roll call in the morning. Tae Rin apologized briefly. The old man waved his hand dismissively. He said he was as useless as a piece of junk and that Tae Rin better not be late tomorrow, or they'd deduct it from his pay, which was practically non-existent anyway. Tae Rin nodded and went up to the second floor. The room turned out to be a tiny cubbyhole, 2 by 3, a mattress on the floor, a table by the window. There was another notebook. This one was hidden under a floorboard. Tae Rin found it because the floorboard creaked differently. A professional habit. When you work on an excavation, you listen to the floor. The second notebook was different. It contained more than just notes. It contained diagrams. The former Tae Rin had been tracking the dates of the disappearances of low-rank hunters, E and D ranks, those whom no one was looking for. And he'd cross-referenced them with the dates when S-rank hunters from major guilds suddenly demonstrated spikes in power. There were 14 matches. At the bottom of the last page was a single word: bones. Tae Rin sat slumped onto the mattress. He looked at that word. The man who had been conducting this investigation was dead, not by accident. Now another man occupied his body, one who had spent his entire previous life doing exactly this: bones, identification, and determining causes of death. Either this was a coincidence that simply doesn't happen, or someone or something had put the right man in the right place. Tae Rin opened the first notebook. On a blank page under the heading Day 1, he added, "The previous owner was conducting an investigation. The investigation involved the bones of missing hunters. The previous owner was eliminated. I'm a bone specialist. Tomorrow's task: to survive." He placed the notebook under his pillow. He lay down. The ceiling was cracked. Somewhere below, an old man with a red face was yelling at someone. Behind the wall, someone was crying quietly. Tae Rin closed his eyes. His body ached all over, every joint, every muscle. This body was worn out, but it was alive, and he knew how to make do with what he had. He always had. The morning began with a shout. Roll call in the courtyard. 7 people. They all looked as if they'd long since stopped trying. The clan leader, the former's uncle, Tae Rin's uncle, stood before them, swaying. His eyes were red. He reeked of soju. He announced that today the clan had received an order for an F-rank dungeon. Another group had already cleared it out. Quiet Stream's task was to collect the monster corpses and haul out the materials. Porters, not even hunters, just porters. One of the young men spat and said it was a disgrace. The uncle replied that the real disgrace was not having enough money for rice. Everyone fell silent. Tae Rin stood at the end of the line. He watched. He listened. He observed. This wasn't a family. It was an organism in its final stages. He'd seen this at archaeological sites. When you find a settlement that died out slowly, the last skeletons lie not in graves, but right on the floor of the dwellings. People had stopped burying one another, stopped trying. This is what the end looks like. A girl stood next to him, short, thin, dark circles under her eyes, just like his. Her hands were covered in minor burns from chemicals, from working with chemicals. She glanced at him briefly and turned away. Yuna, his cousin. He knew this from somewhere, not from the memories of his former body, but from a notebook. The former Tae Rin had mentioned her once. He'd written that Yuna worked 3 jobs and that she was the only reason the clan still existed. The dungeon turned out to be a cave in a hill behind the industrial zone. The entrance was blocked with concrete blocks. Inside, it was dark and damp. The monster corpses had already begun to decompose. Low-level creatures, about the size of a dog, chitinous armor, 6 legs. The Quiet Stream group worked in silence. They dragged the bodies toward the exit. They piled them onto a tarp. Tae Rin helped carry them along with everyone else. His body was weak, but he knew how to distribute the load. He knew how to lift heavy objects properly. Years of work on excavations. 2 hours later, the work was almost done. And then he heard a scream. The team conducting the sweep was returning from deep inside the cave. 4 of them. One of them wasn't walking properly. 2 others were supporting him. Tank, a burly guy in heavy armor. His face was ashen. His left shoulder hung unnaturally low. There was blood on his chest plate. The group's leader, a B rank with a crew cut, was yelling into his communicator that they needed a healer immediately. The reply came 30 seconds later. The nearest healer was a 3-hour drive away. Tank wouldn't last that long. The leader cursed. He looked at his men. They were all wounded, but only slightly. There was no one to help. Tae Rin laid the monster's carcass on the tarp. He wiped his hands on his pants. He approached the wounded man. The group leader looked at him as if he were a fly. He asked what he wanted. Tae Rin didn't answer. He crouched down next to the tank. He placed his hand on the tank's left shoulder. Carefully, precisely, his fingers landed exactly where they needed to be. A habit honed over 20 years, and he felt it. He didn't see it, he felt it. The bone beneath his fingers told him everything. The collarbone was broken in the middle third, an oblique fracture. One fragment had shifted downward and was pressing on the subclavian artery. It was pressing, but hadn't pierced it. Not yet, anyway. If Tank jerked his shoulder, or if he was carried improperly, the fragment would shift another 2 millimeters and pierce the vessel wall. Then there would be internal bleeding and death within 10 minutes. Tae Rin withdrew his hand. He looked at the group leader. He said calmly, "The collarbone is broken in the middle third. The fragment is pressing on the artery, but hasn't pierced it. If he doesn't move his shoulder for 30 minutes, he'll make it to the healer alive. If he jerks it even once, he'll die within 10 minutes. The leader stared at him. He asked how he knew that. Tae Rin didn't answer. Instead, he picked up a piece of broken stone from the ground and began drawing on the concrete block at the entrance. The collarbone, the fracture line, the position of the fragment, the artery. Everything was accurate. All with a single touch. The group leader looked at the drawing, then at Tae Rin, then back at the drawing. He said he'd only seen something like that from S-rank healers. Tae Rin shrugged. He said, "He wasn't a healer. He's the one who reads bones. Only these ones are still alive." They stabilized the tank just as Tae Rin had indicated. They took him to the healer, alive. That evening, the leader of that group came to the clan's dormitory. His name was Chue Dong-hyok, B rank, independent. His face was stern, but his eyes were sharp. He found Tae Rin on the roof. Tae Rin was sitting there writing in a notebook. Dong-hyuk asked who he really was, not by rank, but in essence. Tae Rin thought for a second. He replied that he was a remains specialist. Dong-hyuk asked why a remains specialist would be working as a porter in an F-rank dungeon. Tae Rin closed his notebook. He said it was a good question. Dong-hyuk took out a business card. He placed it on the parapet. He said that if Tae Rin ever decides to work with the living instead of just bones, he should give him a call. He left. Tae Rin picked up the business card. He twirled it between his fingers. He put it in his pocket. Then he opened his notebook to the inventory page. He finished writing. Day 2. Ability detected. Upon contact with bone tissue, information is read. The mechanism is unclear. The result matches a professional analysis, but without equipment. The speed is hundreds of times faster than normal. Hypothesis. Professional skills from a past life have transformed into a systemic ability. Verification required. He closed the notebook. He looked out at Seoul at night. The lights of the towers, the security poles flickered blue. The morning of the third day began with So Yun's voice. She was standing in the doorway of his room, telling him he owed 200,000 won for the dorm, and that if he didn't pay by evening, her uncle would throw his belongings out onto the street. Tae Rin sat up on the mattress. He looked at her. Yuna looked as if she hadn't slept for 3 days. The minor burns on her hands were fresh. The night shift at the pharmacy. He asked how long she'd slept. Yuna blinked. She asked him to repeat it. He repeated himself. How many hours had she slept? Yuna was silent for 3 seconds. Then she replied that it was none of his business and that he'd be better off thinking about money instead of other people's sleep. She turned around and left. Tae Rin got dressed. He went downstairs. His uncle was sitting at the table. There was a bottle in front of him. It was 8 a.m. Tae Rin sat down across from him. He asked if there was any work for today. His uncle looked at him with a glazed expression. He said there was only one job for him. An F-rank dungeon on the outskirts, a single entrance. Wipe out 10 creatures and bring back their cores. The pay was 30,001. Tae Rin asked what kind of creatures they were. His uncle was surprised. The old Tae Rin never asked for details. He'd just go. His uncle replied that they were standard, chitinous, six-legged creatures, small in size, minimal threat level. Tae Rin nodded. He picked up an old dagger from the table that had been lying there as a decoration. His uncle didn't object. Apparently the dagger wasn't worth anything. The F-rank dungeon on the outskirts turned out to be a hole in a hillside behind an abandoned construction site. There was no guard, just a post with a sign. Ying, R, rank F. Status, active. Recommended party size, 1 to 3. Tae Rin went in alone. It was dark inside. The walls were damp. The ground crunched under his feet. He turned on the flashlight from his backpack. The beam illuminated a 2-meter-wide corridor. Bones lay on the floor. Not human, the remains of monsters, old ones. Someone had cleared out this place before and hadn't bothered to clean up. Tae Rin crouched down. He picked up a fragment, the femur of a 6-legged creature, and the moment his fingers closed around the bone, something happened. Information flashed before his eyes. Not text, not a system window. A sensation, as if he were sitting in the Chicago lab again, holding the specimen under a lamp. The bone told him everything. The creature was young, a female. 3 molting cycles. It fed on mush. It moved quickly but predictably. It always attacked with its left front pair of legs. The right hind leg was injured, an old wound. This creature was limping, and then an inscription appeared. Right there in the air before his eyes, translucent. Blue? The system. The reading remains. Skill has been activated. Information on a Class F creature has been obtained. Attack pattern scanned. Do you wish to learn the movement pattern? Yes or no? Tae Rin slowly lowered the bone. He looked at the inscription. He read it again. Then he did what any scientist in his place would have done. He pressed no. First, he needed to understand the mechanism. He picked up another bone, a skull. Different information came through. A different creature. Male. Old 5 cycles. It attacked differently, with its right pair. The system suggested he assimilate it again. No. Again. Tae Rin took out his notebook. He began to take notes. Over the next hour, he examined 23 bone fragments. Each one provided information. Each one suggested he assimilated. He rejected them all. Instead, he compiled a complete behavioral map of the 6-legged creatures, how they move, where they attack from, what their weak points are, where the chitin was thinnest. By the time he finished his notes, he knew more about these creatures than any B-rank hunter knew about monsters of his own level, not because he was stronger, because he knew how to read. He put away his notebook, raised his dagger. He headed deeper in. He heard the first creature before he saw it. The click of chitinous legs on stone. It emerged from a side passage, the size of a large dog. 6 legs. 2 eyes like black beads. Tae Rin didn't move. The creature took a step with its left front pair of legs, just as described in the bone inscriptions. Predictable. Tae Rin stepped to the right. The dagger slipped into the gap between the 3rd and 4th chitinous segments, where the armor was thinnest. He knew this from the bone structure. The creature twitched and went still. Clean, quick, no unnecessary movements. He pulled out the dagger, wiped it on the wall, removed the core from the body. Small, dull, but it was money. The second creature turned out to be larger, a male and old one. It attacked with its right pair. Tae Rin knew this in advance. He stepped to the left. The dagger struck the same spot. The 3rd, the 4th, the 5th. He moved through the dungeon like a surgeon in an operating room. No fuss, no wasted steps. Every movement calculated in advance. By the 10th creature, he was drenched in sweat and his hands were trembling from exhaustion. An E-rank body isn't built for combat, but an E-rank mind was a different story. He had collected 10 cores. He sat down against the wall, caught his breath, looked at the system window floating before his eyes. F-rank dungeon cleared. Reward, experience, 10 F-class cores. Below that was another line. Skill reading. Remains. Rank undetermined. Uses per session 23. Mastered 0. He looked at that line. Mastered 0. 23 readings and not a single one mastered. Any other hunter would have grabbed whatever was on offer. But Tae Rin wasn't just any other hunter. He was a scientist, and scientists collect data first. As he exited the dungeon, he ran into a problem. A man was standing at the core collection point. Tall, an expensive suit, a badge on his lapel, a golden dragon, the Monsoon Guild. The man wasn't looking at Tae Rin. He was looking at his tablet. But Tae Rin noticed how his gaze flinched slightly when Tae Rin emerged from the dungeon alone with 10 cores. E rank alone. 10 cores, a clean sweep without a single scratch. It didn't add up statistically. Tae Rin walked past him. He turned in the cores. He received 30,001. He headed for the bus stop. The man in the suit watched him go. He took out his phone. He dialed a number. Tae Rin didn't look back, but he knew they'd remembered him. Back at the dorm, he gave 200,001 to his uncle. 30,000 for the cores, plus 170,000 he'd found in the previous Tae Rin's stash under the second floorboard. The body's former owner had been saving up, not for himself.
In a notebook next to the money was a note. "For Yuna, in case I don't come back." Tae Rin stared at the note for a long time. Then he put it back. He handed the money to his uncle. His uncle counted it. He muttered something. He put the bottle away. For 5 minutes, something resembling shame flashed in his eyes. Then he poured himself another drink, and the shame vanished.
That evening, Tae Rin sat on the roof and wrote, Day 3, results of the first field test. The reading remains skill works on monster bones. It provides a complete biological picture. The system suggests learning the patterns. I declined. More data is needed. Question. Does the skill work the same way on human bones? Hypothesis. If the system provides monsters' combat patterns, then for human bones, it might provide combat techniques. Needs verification. Problem. Human bones are not freely available. Officially, he closed his notebook. He looked out at the city. Somewhere out there lay bones. Thousands of bones. In the foundations, in restricted zones, in the mass graves of the dungeons. The bones of people who no one had identified, and in his hands was a tool that could read each and every one of them. The door to the roof creaked. Yuna. She came out with a mug, a hot one. She set it down next to him, not for him, for herself, but she set it down next to him. She sat down an arm's length away. She was silent for a minute. Then she asked who he'd been fighting with. Tae Rin didn't understand. Yuna repeated the question. There wasn't a single scratch on him. He'd gone into the dungeon alone, E rank, and he'd come back without a single scratch. Who had he been fighting with? Tae Rin thought for a moment. He replied that he hadn't fought anyone. He hadn't been fighting. He'd been working. Yuna looked at him for a long time. With that look people have when they're used to spotting lies. On the 4th day, Tae Rin found what he was looking for. Not in the dungeon, at a landfill, an industrial zone on the southern outskirts of Seoul. Between an abandoned warehouse and a construction site stood a container labeled Biomaterial Disposal. That's where the remains of monsters that hadn't been sent for processing were dumped. Bones, chitin, chunks of meat, all mixed together. Tae Rin arrived early in the morning. He put on his gloves, not nitrile ones. They didn't sell nitrile gloves here, just regular household ones, but the habit remained. For 3 hours, he sifted through the contents of the container. Monsters. Nothing but monsters. Nothing interesting. He was just about to leave when his fingers stumbled upon a fragment. Small, about the size of a thumbnail. Solid, a different texture. Not chitin, bone, human. The phalanx of an index finger. His skill kicked in instantly. A flash. Information poured in. A man, 34 years old. A D-rank hunter. White Root Clan. Specialization, close combat, short sword, right-handed. His right shoulder had been trained for years. A slashing strike from top to bottom. Muscle memory imprinted in every tendon attachment. And then the rest came. The final moment. Tae Rin saw it, not with his eyes, with his whole body. Darkness, a dungeon, a scream. A man is running. Something large is chasing him. He turns around and strikes. The short sword pierces the flesh. The creature retreats, but there's another one behind him. A blow to the back, the crunch of a spine, pain, and one last thought. A woman's face, young, pregnant. He doesn't know the child's name. The system window appeared immediately. Skill, reading remains. Subject, Park Seong-ho, D rank, date of death, March 7th, 2019. Technique: modified white root / learn yes or no. Tae Rin stood in the junkyard, a tiny bone in his hand. In his mind's eye was the face of a pregnant woman he had never known. He pressed yes. The sensation was like an electric shock, not painful, piercing. His right shoulder twitched on its own. His arm traced an arc, a slashing strike from top to bottom. Clean, precise. Tae Rin's body didn't know this movement, but Park Seong-ho's muscles did, and now that knowledge lay within him like a new layer on top of everything else. Tae Rin lowered his arm. He took out a notebook. He wrote, Park Seong-ho, 34 years old, D rank, White Root Clan, killed on March 7th, 2019, dungeon type, unidentified. He left behind a wife. She was pregnant. He closed the notebook. He looked at the bone in his palm. Then he carefully wrapped it in a handkerchief and placed it in his breast pocket. Every fragment is a person. Every person is a name. He spent another 2 hours at the dump. He found 4 human fragments among tons of monster remains. 4 people, 3 D rank and 1 E rank. All died in the dungeons. All were reported missing. No one was looking for them. He took one technique from each of them, a slashing strike from Park Seong-ho, a low stance dodge from Kim Yeon-jin, a forearm block from Cho Min-hee. A woman. She was 22. She was shielding her partner, who was already dead, and the 4th. A sense of distance from Hwang Jae-ho, the blind E-rank hunter who compensated for his lack of sight with spatial awareness. 4 techniques, 4 layers, 4 strangers' final moments in his head. Tae Rin walked back and felt them stirring inside him. Not like voices, like imprints. Park Seong-ho pulled his right shoulder down. Kim Yeon-jin lowered his center of gravity with every step. Cho Min-hee kept her forearms slightly raised. Hwang Jae-ho turned his head at every sound. 4 habits on top of his own. It was bearable. 4 now, but Tae Rin realized that if he kept this up, in a month he'd stop being able to distinguish his own movements from those of others. He needed a tracking system, not a notebook, a method. In the dorm, he locked himself in his room. He laid out 4 bones on the floor. He marked each one. Name, date, technique, and 1 more column. Promise. Park Seong-ho. Find his wife. Report the circumstances of his death. Kim Yeon-jin. Find her family. Return her remains. Cho Min-hee. Find his partner. Find out if he survived. Hwang Jae-ho. No family, no contacts. Just remember, 4 lines, 4 debts. Tae Rin realized that this was the price. Not mana, not health, not sanity, debt. Each bone isn't a skill. It's a contract. It takes his strength and, in return, promises to finish what the dead man couldn't. If he stops writing them down, if he forgets even one, then the layers will begin to blend and he'll lose himself. The next day, he began training, not in the clan's dojo. There was no dojo, on a vacant lot behind the dormitory, early in the morning when everyone was asleep. 4 techniques. Individually, each one worked. Park Seong-ho's chopping strike landed precisely. Kim Yeon-jin's evasion was fluid. Cho Min-hee's block was reliable. Hwang Jae-ho's sense of space kicked in with every sound. But together they clashed. His body didn't know which layer to obey. His right shoulder wanted to strike from above. His legs wanted to move downward. His forearms rose to block when he needed to attack. Chaos. Tae Rin stopped. He sat down on the ground. He thought he wasn't a fighter. He had never been a fighter, neither in that life nor in this one. He was an anthropologist, and an anthropologist solves problems not with force, but with classification. He opened his notebook. He drew a table. Situation. Frontal attack. Response. Kim Yeon-jin's evasion plus Park Seong-ho's slashing strike. Attack from behind. Response. Hwang Jae-ho's spatial awareness plus Cho Min-hee's block, multiple opponents. Response. Hwang Jae-ho to track. Kim Yeon-jin to evade. Park Seong-ho to counterattack. He didn't combine techniques intuitively as ordinary hunters did. He drew up a response protocol, just as he drew up protocols for examining remains in the lab. Step 1. Assessment. Step 2. Threat classification. Step 3. Selecting a layer. Step 4. Execution. It was slower than the reflexes of a natural-born fighter, but it was more precise and it was scalable. With each new layer, the table expanded. The protocol grew more complex, but the system remained manageable. He trained for 3 hours. By the end, his body ached so much he could barely stand. E rank. His muscles weren't ready for what his mind was demanding of them, but in 3 hours, he'd conducted 20 simulated fights against an imaginary opponent, and in 18 out of 20, the protocol worked correctly. When he returned to the dorm, Han Ji-eun was standing at the entrance. He didn't know that at the time. He only saw a girl, a young one, in light armor with a spear on her back. The spear was old. The wrapping on the shaft was worn away, but the tip gleamed. It had been well cared for. The girl was talking to her uncle loudly. Her uncle was shaking his head. The girl was insisting. Tae Rin walked past them. He went upstairs. An hour later, her uncle came to see him. He said that the heiress of the Iron Crane clan had arrived, a small clan, even smaller than Silent Stream. Her father was offering a contract. She would protect Tae Rin in the dungeons. In exchange, Tae Rin had to do something with her grandfather's bones. His uncle didn't understand exactly what. Tae Rin asked which bones. His uncle shrugged. He said the girl had brought a box with her. Inside the box was a fragment of a shoulder blade her grandfather's, a family heirloom. She wants Tae Rin to decipher her grandfather's technique. Tae Rin froze. He asked how she knew he could do that. His uncle shrugged again. He said rumors travel fast. That B-rank Cho Dong-hyuk told someone. Someone told someone else. And the news reached the Iron Crane. Tae Rin went downstairs. Han Ji-eun was crouching in the courtyard. A spear lay nearby. She was munching on an energy bar. She saw Tae Rin and jumped to her feet. She introduced herself. She spoke quickly, loudly. She stumbled over her words. It was clear she was nervous. She said that her grandfather, Han Sung-ju, had been the best spearman of his generation. B-rank, a legend. He died in a C-rank dungeon 12 years ago. His body was never found. They found only a fragment of a shoulder blade. All of her grandfather's techniques were recorded on video, but Ji-eun had been practicing from those videos for 5 years and still couldn't get it right. Her movements were correct, but she wasn't getting the results. She'd heard that Tae Rin could read bones. Let him read them and tell her what she's doing wrong. Tae Rin looked at her, then at the box she was clutching to her chest. Then he said, "All right." They sat down in the courtyard. Ji-eun opened the box with trembling hands. Inside, resting on red velvet, lay a fragment of a shoulder blade, darkened by time. Tae Rin carefully picked it up. He closed his eyes. His ability kicked in, and this time it was different. Han Sung-ju. 58 years old, B-rank, Iron Crane clan, spearman, 40 years of combat experience. The shoulder blade told the whole story. Right shoulder, worn out rotator cuff, an old knee injury. The left one. He compensated by shifting his weight to his right leg. All his strikes were built around this compensation. The spear didn't travel in a straight line, but in an arc, because a straight strike would put strain on his injured knee. And here's the thing. Ji-eun copied her grandfather's movements from the video. Exactly. Perfectly. But her grandfather's movements had been adapted to accommodate his injury, to his body, to 40 years of habitually compensating for knee pain. Ji-eun's knee is healthy. She was mimicking a compensation for an injury she didn't have. It's as if a healthy person were walking with a cane, imitating a limping person. Tae Rin opened his eyes. He looked at Ji-eun. He said that her grandfather was a great spear, but he had an old injury to his left knee, and his entire technique was built around that injury. Ji-eun turned pale. She asked how he knew. Tae Rin pointed to her shoulder blade. He said it was evident from the wear on the glenoid cavity. The rotation of her shoulder joint compensated for the load her knee couldn't bear. Every strike, every stance, every step, everything was adapted to her limp. Ji-eun had been mimicking the limp for 5 years. She didn't need to do that. Her knee was healthy. She needed to strike in a straight line. Ji-eun was silent. Then she stood up. She raised her spear. Oh, she assumed a stance, the same one as in her grandfather's video. Tae Rin shook his head. He said she needed to stand wider. Left foot forward. Weight evenly distributed on both feet. Ji-eun adjusted her stance. She struck. The spear whistled through the air. in a straight line, no arc. The tip pierced right through the wooden post in the courtyard. Ji-eun looked at the pierced post, then at her hands, then at Tae Rin. Tears welled up in her eyes. She said quietly, 5 years. For 5 years, she'd thought she wasn't talented enough, that she didn't deserve her grandfather's technique, but it had all been because of her knee. Tae Rin nodded. He said it was always about the bones. The system window flashed. The piercing crane technique has been mastered. A modified version, without injury compensation, rank C. Tae Rin looked at it. He hadn't asked the system to master it. It had done it on its own. Because he hadn't just read the technique. He'd understood it, reconstructed it, improved it, and the system counted that as mastering a new level. Interesting. He took out his notebook. He wrote it down. Han Sung-gu, 58 years old, rank B, a slayer, died in a C-rank dungeon, left behind a granddaughter who spent 5 years replicating his pain, a promise, already fulfilled. The contract with the Iron Crane clan was simple. Han Ji-eun protects Tae Rin in the dungeons. In exchange, Tae Rin advises her on technique. Term 3 months. Her father, Han Jong-ho, arrived 2 days later to sign the papers. A small, thin man with tired eyes. He looked at the quiet stream dormitory, at the peeling walls, at her uncle, who could barely stand on his feet, at Tae Rin, who looked like a shadow in human form. Then he looked at his daughter, who was smiling for the first time in 5 years, and he signed. Ji-eun moved into a room on the first floor of the dormitory. She took a corner. She leaned her spear against the wall. She unpacked her things in 10 minutes. 20 minutes later, she was already arguing with her uncle about how dirty the common room was, and that she had no intention of living in a pigsty. Her uncle was taken aback. In the Quiet Stream clan, no one but him had raised their voice in a long time. So-yoon watched from the doorway. There was something like relief on her face, as if someone had finally said what she'd wanted to say for 5 years. Their first joint dungeon run took place the next day. It was an E-rank dungeon, rank dungeon. More serious than the one Tae Rin had gone into alone. The creatures were larger, faster. Some were armored. Ji-eun led the way, spear in hand. Her movements had changed after Tae Rin explained about his grandfather's knee. Her stance was wider. Her strikes were direct. She was fast, strong, B rank in terms of raw combat power, but officially listed as C because the Iron Crane clan couldn't afford to have her re-evaluated. Tae Rin followed behind, a dagger in his hand, but it was of little use. His task was different. He was collecting bones, every monster corpse, every skeleton in the corner, every fragment protruding from the wall. He touched them and read them. The monsters yielded little. Behavioral patterns, weak points, useful but not critical. And then on the 3rd floor of the dungeon, he found it. A niche in the wall, blocked with stones. He cleared away the stones. Behind them was a skeleton, human, complete, wearing the remnants of light armor. Tae Rin crouched down beside it. Ji-eun stood behind him, watching. He placed his hand on the skull. The skill activated. Jong Hyai-won, 27 years old. C-rank, Silver Wind clan, swordswoman, left-handed, died 4 years ago. The dungeon had been listed as E-rank. On the 3rd floor, there were sea-level creatures, or a trap, or an error in the assessment, more likely a trap. At the last moment, she stood against the wall. Behind her was a niche. She shoved herself into the niche and caused the stones to collapse. She hid. The creature couldn't reach her, but she couldn't get out either. She ran out of air. Or blood. A wound on her thigh. The femoral artery was severed. She was dying, slowly. Her last thought, "Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't want to let you down." Tae Rin opened his eyes. His hands were shaking. This was his 2nd human reading, and it was harder than the first. The 4 readings at the dump had gone by quickly. The fragments were small, the impressions were fragmented, but the complete skeleton provided the full picture. He lived through every last minute of Jong Hyai-won's life in its entirety, every breath, every heartbeat, darkness, fear, and acceptance. She accepted death quietly, without A scream. It was hard. The system suggested he learn left-handed sword technique, silver wind style, rank C. Tae Rin looked at the suggestion, then at the skeleton, then at Ji Yoon, who was standing behind him, waiting. He pressed yes. His left shoulder twitched. A new layer settled over the others. Now there were 6 of them, 6 dead people in one living body. He took out his notebook. He wrote down a name, a date, the circumstances. In the promise column, he wrote, "Find her mother. Tell her that her daughter didn't chicken out. She hid and waited for help. Help never came." Then he carefully gathered the bones. He put them in a bag from his backpack. Ji-yoon didn't ask why. She just helped carry it. They finished the dungeon. They collected the cores. At the exit, Tae Rin asked Ji-yoon if she knew the Silverwind clan. Ji-yoon thought for a moment. She said she'd heard of them. A small clan. It disbanded 3 years ago. The leader died in a dungeon. After that, the members went their separate ways. Tae Rin asked if the leader was left-handed. Ji-yoon didn't know. Tae Rin nodded. That evening, he sat in his room looking at these 6 entries in his notebook and thought, 6 layers in 5 days. 4 close combat techniques, 1 spatial sense, 1 sword technique. His E-rank body couldn't keep up. His muscles ached constantly. His joints cracked. In the morning, he'd wake up and for a few seconds couldn't figure out whose hands were lying on the blanket. He needed to slow down, but the world wouldn't let him. On the 6th day, a visitor came to the dorm, a middle-aged man, polite, in a nice suit. He introduced himself as Nam Given, Talent Development Coordinator for the Musen Guild. Tae Rin recognized the pin on his lapel, a golden dragon, the same one the man at the core reception point had worn. Nam Gi-won spoke softly. He said the guild had taken notice of the young hunter's outstanding performance. An E-rank hunter clearing a dungeon single-handedly, that's impressive. The Musan Guild is always on the lookout for talent. There's a support program, funding, training, equipment, housing, everything needed for growth. Tae Rin listened. He nodded. Then he asked one thing. He asked what exactly the guild wanted in return. Nam Given smiled. He said nothing special. Loyalty, an exclusive contract. All cores and materials from dungeons go through Monsoon, and full access to his skill for the research department. Tae Rin asked for clarification on what full access to the skill meant. Nam Gi-won explained. Analyses, tests, observing the skill in action under controlled conditions. It sounded harmless. Tae Rin heard something else. They want to understand how it works, take it apart, copy it, or destroy it if they can't copy it. He knew this pattern. In his past life, his research advisor had sold an identification method to a private laboratory network. The lab got the patent. The university got the money. The students who developed the method got nothing. Tae Rin thanked him for the offer. He said he needed time to think it over. Nam Gi-won left his business card. He left. His uncle was waiting in the hallway. His eyes were clear. For the first time in a week, he told Tae Rin that he'd be an idiot to refuse, that Musen meant protection, money, and a future, that the entire clan could live in comfort if Tae Rin signed the contract. Tae Rin replied that he'd think about it. His uncle grabbed him by the sleeve. He said there was nothing to think about. He said he was the clan leader and that he could force him to do it. Tae Rin looked at his uncle's hand, then at his face. Then he gently removed his uncle's fingers from his sleeve. He said one thing. He said that if his uncle forced him, Tae Rin would leave the clan, alone, with no debts, but also no obligations. And then Quiet Stream would be left without even the one trump card they currently had. His uncle remained silent. Tae Rin went up to his room. Yuna was standing on the stairs. She'd heard everything. She looked at him, not with suspicion, as before, but with something new. Tae Rin walked past her. Once in his room, he sat down on the mattress. He opened his notebook. He wrote, Day 6. The Monsoon Guild offered a contract. I turned it down. The recruitment approach was gentle. The next stage will be tougher. I need to speed things up. I need to become strong enough so that my refusal carries some weight. Right now, I'm an E rank, interesting only as a curiosity. If I become a C rank, my refusal will be seen as a challenge. If I become a B rank, they'll respect me, problem. To grow quickly, I need bones. Human ones. High-ranking ones. They aren't freely available. Official hunter cemeteries are closed. Restricted zones are off limits. Well, there's another way. He thought for an hour. Then he remembered the notes of the former Tae Rin. He'd mentioned an old battlefield from the Korean War, a place where no one goes because it's supposedly haunted, not a dungeon, not a restricted zone, just an abandoned field where soldiers died 70 years ago. Hunters leave it alone because there are no monsters there. The association doesn't control it because there's nothing to control. But if Mina is the residual power of the dead, then there must be something on a field where thousands of people died. Maybe not to combat equipment, maybe not ranks, but something be there. Tae Rin jotted down the coordinates tomorrow. He needed Ji-yoon and a map and a shovel. Before going to sleep, he reread his notes. 6 names, 6 promises, 1 fulfilled, 5 to go. Tomorrow would be his 7th day in this world. 1 week. In a week, he'd gone from a man lying on a concrete bench to a man being recruited by the country's largest guild. Not because he was strong, but because he was the only one who knew how to do what he did. That was both a strength and a weakness. A monopoly attracts attention, and in this world, attention means danger. The field was a 3-hour drive from Seoul, a bus to the county seat, then on foot through rice paddies and copses. Juan walked beside him, a spear on her back, a backpack with food and water. She didn't ask where they were going or why. He said it was necessary, and that was enough. Tae Rin carried his own backpack, a notebook, a flashlight, gloves, a small entrenching shovel bought at a hardware store. It looked like an archaeologist's gear, not a hunter's. Because that's exactly what it was, an archaeologist's gear. They saw the field from a distance, a gentle hill, grass up to their waists. At the top stood 3 dark trees, nothing else around, no houses, no roads, just the wind and the smell of wet earth. Tae Rin stopped. He closed his eyes. He tried to sense it, and he did. Not like in the dungeon. Quieter, deeper. The earth beneath his feet hummed. Not from mana, from memory. Hundreds of people had lain here. He sensed them the way an anthropologist senses an excavation site. Not mystically, professionally. The density of the soil, the micro-relief. Subsidence in the spots where bodies had decomposed and the earth had settled. He walked across the field, reading it like a book. Here was a trench. Filled in, but its outline was visible. Here was a shell crater, overgrown, but its shape was distinctive. Here was a mass grave, 3 by 6 meters. The ground had subsided by 20 centimeters. A standard mass grave. He knew this size. He'd seen them in Bosnia, in Rwanda. Every continent has its own wars, but the graves are the same. Ji-yoon stood to the side and watched him walk. How he stopped, how he crouched, how he touched the ground. She didn't understand what he was doing, but she didn't interfere. Tae Rin found the spot, the edge of the mass grave, the shallowest layer. He took off his backpack, put on gloves, grabbed a trowel, began to dig, carefully, in thin layers, like an archaeological, not digging, but removing the soil, layer by layer. At a depth of 40 centimeters, the trowel struck something, a bone. Tae Rin set the trowel aside. He took a brush out of his pocket, an ordinary painter's brush, trimmed down, and began to clear away the soil. It took an hour. Ji-eun sat nearby and watched in silence. A fragment emerged from the ground. A femur. Human. Old. 70 years in the ground. Tae Rin picked it up with both hands. His instincts kicked in, and the world began to blur. Park Cheol-soo, 19 years old. Private in the Republic of Korea Army. 3rd the Infantry Division, 1950. Drafted from a village in Gyeongsang Province. A farmer. Had never held a weapon before the war. 2 weeks of training, then the front lines. A boy, 19 years old, skinny, hungry, terrified. The final moment, a nighttime attack. He's lying in a trench, firing into the darkness. Can't see where he's aiming. A sergeant is shouting nearby. Something explodes. Light. Pain in his stomach. He looks down and sees that his stomach is gone. His last thought, I don't even know who I was shooting at. Tae Rin set the bone down. His hands were shaking. This was different. Not a hunter, a soldier, a boy. The system flashed. Skill, reading remains. Subject, Park Cheol-soo. Rank, N/A. Combat techniques, no. Physical characteristics, no. Assimilation, impossible. Impossible, because Park Cheol-soo wasn't a hunter. He was an ordinary person. His bones contained no mana, no techniques, nothing the system could digitize. But Tae Rin knew his name anyway. He knew how he had lived, how he had died. He knew he had left behind a mother and two younger sisters in a village in Gyeongsang province. He opened his notebook. He wrote it down. Park Cheol-soo, 19 years old, private, 3rd Infantry Division, killed in 1950. A village in Gyeongsang province. Family, mother, and two sisters. Then he dug deeper. Over the next 5 hours, he extracted 12 fragments, 12 people, 9 Korean soldiers, 3 American soldiers. Each had a name. Each had a story. Each had a final moment. None contained combat tactics. None provided insights. But each provided information, names, units, dates, circumstances. Tae Rin wrote it all down. His notebook grew by 12 pages, 12 names, 12 final thoughts. A private who thought of a rice paddy, a sergeant who counted his men and couldn't account for 3, an American corporal from Ohio who thought of a dog named Buddy, and he sensed something else. The system wouldn't let him process it. But his body was changing, not because of the techniques, because of understanding. 12 bodies had passed through his hands, and each one told him how its owner had moved, not as a soldier, as a living person, how he walked, how he turned, how he fell. These weren't techniques, these were data, biomechanical data, and the anthropologist inside him began to process it. By evening, he knew more about human movement than he had in all his years of study, not abstractly, with his body. Each corpse left behind a microscopic layer, not a skill, not a technique, an understanding. How the hip works when climbing a hill, how weight is distributed during a turn, how the body tucks in during a fall. 12 layers, not of combat experience, but of human experience. The system didn't count it, but his body accepted it. When he stood up from his knees that evening, he felt the difference. He moved differently, more fluidly, more precisely, not more powerfully, precisely, more precisely, as if a calibration had been performed. Ji-eun noticed. She asked what he'd been doing all this time. Tae Rin replied that he'd been working. Ji-eun looked at the excavation site, at the carefully extracted fragments laid out on cloth, at the notebook with his notes. She asked if he was an archaeologist. Tae Rin thought for a second and replied that it was something like that. They headed back. Halfway to the bus stop, Tae Rin stopped. He turned around and looked at the field. There lay hundreds more. Thousands, soldiers whom no one had been looking for in 70 years, who had neither mana nor skills nor ranks, just names. He'll return, not for power, for the names. On the bus, Ji-eun fell asleep. Her head was tilted toward the window. Her spear was clamped between her knees. Tae Rin sat next to her, writing in a notebook. He was summarizing the first week, 7 days. 6 combat techniques from the hunters, 12 names of soldiers without techniques, 1 ability the system can't classify, 1 body that's starting to obey him, 1 clan falling apart, 1 recruit from the guild, 1 girl with a spear who trusts him, 1 cousin who doesn't trust him, 1 alcoholic uncle, and 2 notebooks, 1 open, filled with names and promises. 1 hidden, containing an investigation into its former owner. He isn't ready to bring them together yet. But he'll have to soon. The bus was traveling through the evening suburbs. Lights, dungeon signs, billboards featuring the faces of S-rank hunters. One of the billboards showed a middle-aged man with noble features and golden armor. A name beneath the photo, Chang Yui-sop, Guildmaster Musan, Defender of the Nation, number 1. Tae Rin stared at that face. The man who, in 2005, organized the cleanup of the first burial sites, who built an empire on the bones of the nameless. The man who sent a recruiter to Tae Rin 6 days ago. Tae Rin felt no hatred. Hatred is an emotion. He felt professional interest, just as an investigator feels when looking at a suspect's photo on the department bulletin board. He turned the page of his notebook. He wrote a new heading, Case Number 1, Unidentified Remains in the Foundations of the Guilds. Suspect, Jang Yuisop, Monsoon Guild. Status, Preliminary Investigation. Below that, he added, Method, same as always. First the bones, then the names, then the truth. He closed his notebook. The bus pulled into Seoul. The streetlights glowed blue from the protective runes. The city went about its business. It had no idea that sitting in the back seat of a cheap bus was a man with 2 notebooks, one for the dead, one for the living. On the 8th day, Tae Rin returned to the biomaterial landfill, alone, without Ji-un. He'd told her he was going to get some supplies. He didn't want to lie to her, but he didn't want to explain why he was rummaging through the waste either. Not yet. The dump greeted him with the smell of rotting chitin and the buzz of flies. He put on his gloves. He got to work. This time, he wasn't searching at random. He had noticed a pattern. Containers arrived from various dungeons. Each had a tag with a number and a rank. He chose a container from a C-rank dungeon. The higher the dungeon's rank, the greater the chance of finding the remains of a powerful hunter. The logic was simple. Strong people venture into dangerous dungeons. Strong people sometimes die. Their bodies are recovered, but not always in their entirety. A fragment of a rib, small, broken off, stuck between the chitin plates of a large monster. Someone hadn't noticed it while butchering the carcass. Or maybe they had noticed but didn't bother with it. Tae Rin picked up the fragment, his skill activated. And this time, it was powerful. Oh, Jinsu, 31 years old, B rank, Hansen Guild, tank, specializing in shielding and territory control. The final moment, a C-rank dungeon. The clear was going according to plan. The boss on the 3rd floor, a beast the size of a bus. Oh, Jinsu took his place on the front line. The shield took the blow. The force of the impact drove his feet into the stone up to his ankles. He held his ground. He always held his ground. Behind him, 4 damage dealers were attacking the monster. Everything was going according to plan. Then a second monster emerged from the wall, one that wasn't in the intel, one that wasn't supposed to be there. A strike from the side. The shield didn't have time to turn. Oh, Jeans fell. He got up. Blood was coming from his ear, a concussion. He raised the shield. He stood once more between the team and the 2 creatures, 1 against 2. He held out for another 4 minutes, long enough for the team to retreat. His last thought, it's a good thing Minu can't see this. Minu was his son, 3 years old. Tae Rin stood in the junkyard, a broken rib fragment in his hand. The image was etched in his mind. A man who knew he was going to die and raised his shield anyway, not because he was a hero, because there were people behind him. The system offered to teach him. Hansen's shield stance technique, rank B, reinforced grounding, distance control. Tae Rin pressed yes. His legs cramped, his feet dug into the ground. For a second, he felt a weight that wasn't there. The weight of the shield, the weight of responsibility, the weight of 4 people behind him. Then it passed, 7th layer. A new entry appeared in his notebook. Oh, Jinsu, 31 years old, rank B, tank, Hansen Guild. Killed while covering the team's retreat, Min's son, 3 years old at the time of his death. He's 6 or 7 now. A promise to find him, to tell him. Tae Rin spent another 4 hours at the junkyard. He found 3 fragments, 2 from D ranks, 1 from a C rank. Each provided a skill, each provided a name, each provided a final moment. By the end of the day, he had 10 layers inside him, 10 other people's lives, 10 other people's deaths. His head was buzzing, not from pain, from being overwhelmed. As he walked home, he stumbled 3 times on level ground. His legs were tangled. His right leg wanted to take Oh Jinsu's long stride. His left leg reached for Kim Yeonjin's half squat. His arms rose into Cho Min-hee's blocking stance at every sharp sound. Layers upon layers. He had foreseen this. At home, he locked himself in his room. He took out his notebook. He reread every entry. He said each name aloud, quietly, like a roll call. Park Seung-ho, Kim Yeonjin, Cho Min-hee, Hwang Jae-ho, Jeon Hae-won, Han Seonju, Oh Jinsu Bae-gi-ru, Yeon So-yeon, Kang Tae-hyun. 10 names, 10 people. He closed his eyes and mentally arranged them throughout his body, like files in an archive. Park Sung-ho in his right shoulder, Kim Yeon-jin in his legs, Cho Min-hee in his forearms, Hwang Jae-ho in his hearing, Jong Hae-won in his left arm, Han Sung-ju in the curve of his torso, Oh Jin-soo in his feet. Each had its own place, each had its own box. When he opened his eyes, his body obeyed. Not perfectly, but noticeably better than 5 minutes ago. The method was working. As long as there were 10 residents, he could manage. But what if there were 50 or 100? Then he'd need something more than a notebook. On the 9th day, he went to the public library. He found the medical literature section. For 3 hours, he read anatomy textbooks in Korean. He knew the language, the former Tae Rin knew it. His body remembered. But the terms were different. A different system of notation. He needed to translate his knowledge from English medical terminology into Korean and overlay it onto the local system of ranks and skills. He compiled a table, every muscle group, every joint, every tendon attachment, and next to each entry, the name of the layer that dwells there. It wasn't a magical system, it was an anatomical map overlaid with a registry of the dead. A forensic anthropologist from Chicago was solving the problems of a new world with the tools of the old. And it worked. On the 10th day, Ji-eun asked him for training. Not his training, her own. She wanted to continue working on her grandfather's technique. Tae Rin agreed. They went out to the vacant lot behind the dormitory. Ji-eun assumed a stance, wider than before, left foot forward. She had memorized his every word. She struck. The spear whistled through the air. Good, but not perfect. Tae Rin watched, not as a coach, as an anthropologist. He saw her body as a set of levers and joints, the shoulder joint, hip rotation, weight transfer. Everything was correct. Almost. The problem was in her wrist. She regripped the spear a millisecond before the strike. A micro movement, imperceptible to the naked eye. But Tae Rin had spent thousands of hours analyzing human movement. He saw it. He told her that she was gripping the spear too tightly, that her right hand made a twist just before the strike, that this cost her 3% of her power and 2 centimeters of accuracy. Ji-eun tried loosening her grip. She struck again. The spear sank 5 centimeters deeper into the wooden post than before. She turned to him, her eyes wide. He shrugged. He said it wasn't magic. It was biomechanics. On the 11th day, what he had been waiting for and fearing happened. Yuna came to the dorm. She didn't live there. She rented a tiny room closer to the pharmacy where she worked. She came twice a week to check on the clan, bring groceries, and pay the bills. She came in the morning. She found Tae Rin in his room. He was sitting on the floor, surrounded by papers, a chart of anatomical diagrams, a list of names, and maps of the dungeons. She looked at all of it, then at him. Then she closed the door and sat down across from him. She said she wanted to talk. Tae Rin put the papers away. He waited. Yuna spoke slowly. She chose her words carefully. She said she'd known Tae Rin since he was born, that he was a quiet boy who was afraid of dungeons and drew in his notebooks, that he never looked people in the eye, that he never asked questions, that he didn't know how to cook, didn't know how to do laundry, and didn't know how to talk to strangers. And now he clears dungeons all by himself. He talks to B-rank hunters as equals. He turns down the Musan Guild. He saves a stranger's life with a single touch, and he calls the body he inhabits his tool rather than himself. She'd heard him talk to his uncle about trump cards. The old Tae Rin didn't even know the word trump card. Tae Rin remained silent. Yuna waited. The second week, Tae Rin began venturing into dungeons every day, with Ji-eun, sometimes just the two of them. Sometimes as part of random groups that recruited additional fighters at the entrance. His official rank was E, but after clearing a few dungeons, rumors had already begun to spread. An E rank who moves like a C rank. An E rank who sees an attack before it even begins. An E rank who never misses. Tae Rin didn't draw attention to himself on purpose, but he didn't hide either. Hiding makes you look suspicious. Instead, he chose a different strategy to be useful. In every group, he immediately found his niche. Not a leader, not a tank, not a damage dealer, an analyst. He entered the dungeon first. He collected monster bones. 30 seconds to analyze. Behavior type, attack pattern. Vulnerabilities. Then he briefed the group. Concise. To the point. This creature attacks with its left pair when you get within 3 meters. Vulnerable spot between the 4th and 5th segments. Don't approach from the right, it has a blind spot on the left. Groups that listened to him cleared dungeons faster and cleaner than usual. Groups that didn't listen came out with wounded members, once with a dead body. A D rank who decided that advice from an E rank was an insult. He charged at a monster from the front. The monster turned out to be faster. Tae Rin managed to shout a warning. He didn't make it in time. They pulled the guy out, but they couldn't save his right arm. Tae Rin stood at the dungeon exit and watched as the healers loaded the stretcher into the car. Ji-eun approached. She stood beside him. She said quietly that it wasn't his fault. Tae Rin replied that he knew, that the fault lay with those who didn't listen. But that didn't stop him from feeling it. She didn't say anything. She just stood beside him. By the third week, he had moved on to D-rank dungeons. It was harder here. The monsters were bigger, more aggressive. Some showed signs of intelligence. They acted in groups. They set up ambushes. There's no place for E-rank here. But Tae Rin hadn't been E-rank for a long time. 10 combat layers from fallen hunters, 12 layers of biomechanical understanding from soldiers, an anatomical map of distribution in his head, a response protocol honed by daily training. His body was weak. E-rank muscles, E-rank speed, E-rank stamina, but his movements were C-rank. Every step was measured. Every dodge was calculated. He wasn't faster than the monsters. He was more precise. He knew where they would strike before they even began to move, because their bones were in his pocket. Not metaphorically. Literally. Before every dungeon, he spent 20 minutes examining the dead monsters at the entrance. 20 minutes, and he knew everything about what awaited inside. Groups began inviting him. First, those who had already worked with him, then acquaintances of acquaintances, then strangers. A nickname emerged. The Bone Doctor. He didn't like it, but there's no point in fighting nicknames. On the 20th day, he was clearing a D-rank dungeon with a group of 6, 4 D-ranks, Ji-eun, and him. On the 4th floor, the monsters were larger than usual. One of them damaged a wall and caused the passageway to collapse. The group was split up. Tae Rin and 2 D-rankers were on one side. Ji-eun and the rest were on the other. The rubble was dense. It would take a long time to clear. And on this side, 3 creatures were moving down the corridor. D-rankers. The 2 D-ranks were mediocre fighters. To be honest, they were terrible fighters. 1 swordsman with a dull sword, 1 archer with 7 arrows, Tae Rin with a dagger. Against 3 creatures, each weighing as much as a passenger car. He thought for 2 seconds. Then he turned to the swordsman and the archer. He said briefly, "Aim for the eyes, not the left one, but the right. That's where the nerve center is." He told the swordsman to stand to his right and strike only when the creature turned its back between the 3rd and 4th segments, nowhere else. The archer asked how he knew about the nerve center. Tae Rin didn't answer. The first creature emerged from around the bend. The archer fired. He hit the right eye. The creature twitched. It froze for half a second. The nerve center. Paralysis. Tae Rin lunged forward. Kim Yeon-jin's dodge. Lower, even lower. Under the belly. Dagger upward. Between the segments. The creature collapsed. The second creature charged immediately. The swordsman struck from the right. He hit it, but didn't pierce it. A blunt sword. The creature turned toward him. Its back to Tae Rin. Tae Rin jumped. Not graceful, not heroic. Awkwardly, crookedly. An E-rank body didn't know how to jump gracefully, but the dagger struck true. Between the segments. The creature fell. The third one, the largest. It hadn't attacked. It stood and watched. Black, beady eyes. The beginnings of intelligence. It was assessing the situation. Tae Rin stood before it, drenched in sweat. His hands were shaking. The dagger was covered in blood. His body was at its limit. One more fight, and he'd collapse. The creature took a step back, then another. It turned around. It vanished into the darkness. The archer behind him exhaled. He asked in a trembling voice what that had been. Tae Rin replied that the creature had assessed its losses and decided it wasn't. 2 corpses out of 3 is a bad statistic for a pack. The archer asked how an E-rank knew such things. Tae Rin replied that he reads a lot. An hour later, Ji-eun and the others cleared the rubble. Ji-eun burst into the passageway first, spear at the ready. She saw Tae Rin alive. 2 dead monsters, 2 full D-ranks. She looked at him. He looked terrible, pale, wet, barely standing, but alive. She walked over and without a word adjusted the collar of his jacket, which had ridden up. Then she turned and went to check the corridor. It was a gesture. Small, meaningful. She didn't ask if everything was all right. She showed that he was fine and moved on. On the evening of the 20th day, Tae Rin took stock of the past 3 weeks. 14 combat layers, 12 biomechanical ones. The system classified him as E-rank. His actual combat effectiveness was at the C level, maybe C+ under favorable conditions. His body wasn't keeping up with his mind. His muscles couldn't keep pace with his techniques. His speed wasn't there. Strength wasn't there. Stamina was at rock bottom. He needed to build up his physical condition, the usual way, through training, food, rest, things that an E rank from a destitute clan didn't have. Or maybe he did. Tae Rin looked at Cho Dong-hyuk's business card. B rank, independent. The man whose tank he'd saved on the first day. Tae Rin picked up his phone. He dialed the number. Dong-hyuk answered on the third ring. Tae Rin said he was ready to work with the living, but on his own terms. Choi Dong-hyuk turned out to be a man of action. They met at a diner near the subway station 2 hours after the call. Dong-hyuk came alone. No armor, just a regular jacket. He sat across from Tae Rin, ordered 2 coffees without asking. Looked at Tae Rin, said he was glad he'd called, then got straight to the point. He had a group of 5 people. All independent. B and C ranks. They clear medium difficulty dungeons. They make decent money. The problem is that they're making less than they could because they spend too much time on reconnaissance. They enter cautiously, they move slowly, they waste hours figuring out monster behavior through trial and error. If they had someone who provided information before the fight rather than after, they could double their clearing speed and triple their earnings. Tae Rin nodded. He said he could do that. The conditions. He won't sign a contract. He'll work on a per-job basis. He has the right to refuse any dungeon. His share of the loot isn't fixed, but based on his contribution. And one additional condition. All bone fragments found in the dungeon belong to him. All of them. Without exception. Monster bones and human bones. Dong-hyuk looked at him. He asked why he wanted the bones. Tae Rin replied that it was his specialty. Dong-hyuk thought for a moment. He said that nobody needs bones. They need cores. They need materials. Bones are trash. If Tae Rin wants trash, let him take it. They shook hands. Their first run with Dong-hyuk's group took place the next day. A C-rank dungeon, a serious one. 5 floors. The boss on the 5th. Dong-hyuk's party. Dong-hyuk himself, a B-rank tank. Shield and sword, calm, reliable. Next to him was Park Do-hyun, a B-rank damage dealer. 2-handed sword. A quiet guy with the face of someone who's seen too much. Yoon Se-ra, a C-rank archer, rank archer. Accurate, fast, sharp-tongued. Kwon Hyeon, a C-rank support mage, skinny, nervous. He boosted others' attacks and set up barriers. And Jong Il-ru, a C-rank healer, the oldest in the group, 36 years old. Quiet, effective, plus Jiyeon, plus Tae Rin, 7 people. At the entrance, Tae Rin asked for 20 minutes. No one objected. Dong-hyuk had warned the group in advance. Tae Rin surveyed the area in front of the dungeon. He found the remains of monsters. There were many of them here. It just this C-rank dungeon was cleared regularly. Dead creatures lay in heaps. 20 minutes. Yours 12 fragments. Trails of Frights 12 readings. He returned to the groove and began to speak, and there are 3 types of creatures on the first floor. The first type attacks in a straight line. They're vulnerable from the side. The second type jumps. They're vulnerable from below the moment they land. There's half a second when they're motionless. The third type spits acid. The effective range is 4 meters. You're safe at 5 meters. The acid won't penetrate a standard magical barrier, but it corrodes leather armor in 12 seconds. The group listened in silence. Yoon Se-ra raised an eyebrow. She asked how he knew that. Tae Rin replied that he'd read it. Sarah asked again, "Where did you read it?" Tae Rin pointed to a pile of bones. "There." Sarah opened her mouth. Then she closed it. She turned to Dong-hyuk. He nodded. He confirmed it. "This guy reads bones." They went inside. They cleared the first floor in 40 minutes. It usually takes Dong-hyuk's group 2 hours. Every creature they encountered was dealt with according to protocol. Dong-hyuk took the hits on his shield. Do-hyun slashed at vulnerable spots. Sira shot at the nerve centers. Hyun set up barriers exactly 4 meters away from the spitters. Iru stood in the back, bored. No one was injured, not a single surprise. On the second floor, Tae Rin found more remains. He counted them, he reported. There was a new type on this floor. An underground one. It strikes from beneath the floor. It's vibration sensitive. It reacts to heavy footsteps. Dong-hyuk looked down at his heavy boots. He looked at Tae Rin. Tae Rin said it would be better for Dong-hyuk to go last and let Sarah go first. She's the lightest. Minimal vibration. The creature won't react. Sarah will go ahead and shoot from above when the creature crawls out toward Dong-hyuk. Sarah said she'd never gone first in her life. Then she added, "Fine, so be it. If the bone doctor says so, then that's how it has to be." The plan worked. The creature came out at the sound of Dong-hyuk's heavy footsteps. Sarah waited. The arrow struck precisely the windpipe on its back. The creature collapsed before it could attack. 3rd floor. 4th. Each time, Tae Rin analyzed the remains. Each time, he gave precise instructions. By the 4th floor, the team was moving like a well-oiled machine. Everyone knew their role. Everyone trusted the information. Even Do-hyun, who hadn't said a word in 3 hours, turned to Tae Rin and gave a brief nod. For Do-hyun, that was the equivalent of a speech. On the 5th floor was the boss, a massive creature, 3 meters tall, 6 claws reinforced with bone plates, chitin as thick as a finger, 4 eyes, all in the front, a blind spot in the back. Tae Rin didn't find the boss's remains at the entrance. No one had died next to the boss and been left lying there. The bodies had been taken away. But he found something else. A fragment of a claw, broken off, old. The claw told a story. This creature had lived here for at least 3 years. It had molted 4 times. With each molt, the chitin grew thicker. The claw had broken once, so it had been striking something harder than itself, the dungeon wall. It strikes the wall with its paw, a habit, like a tick. Before an attack, with its right front paw, Tae Rin reported, the group braced themselves. The boss emerged from the darkness, huge, black, 4 eyes glowing. Its right front paw twitched. It struck the wall, a tick. Just as Tae Rin had said. And the moment the paw was against the wall, Dong-hyuk rammed his shield into its side. Do-hyun slashed at the spot where the claw was regrowing. A weak spot. Sarah fired 3 arrows into the space between its eyes. Hyun cast a barrier just as the creature tried to counterattack. The fight lasted 4 minutes. The usual time for a C-rank boss is at least 20 minutes. When the creature fell, Dong-hyuk stood over it and looked at Tae Rin. Then he said he'd been working with hunters for 10 years, with A ranks, with S ranks. None of them had ever done what this guy was doing. Tae Rin sat against the wall, drinking water from a canteen. He hadn't participated in the boss fight. His job was before the fight. Intelligence and analysis. Records. They handled the rest. Tae Rin's share of the loot was 15%. That was more than the healer's share. And no one objected. That evening, Dong-hyuk called him. He said the group wanted to work with him on a permanent basis. Tae Rin replied that he'd work in shifts, 2 days with them, 3 days on his own business. Dong-hyuk agreed. He didn't ask him what his own business was. In his first week working with Dong-hyuk's group, Tae Rin earned more than the Quiet Stream clan made in a month. He gave half to the clan's fund. His uncle took the money without a word. This time, he didn't pull out a bottle. Tae Rin spent the other half on food. Real food, meat, fish, good rice, not the cheap kind, eggs, milk. An E-rank body needed protein, calcium, and calories. He put together his own diet, not based on the system's standard menus for hunters, based on his knowledge as an anthropologist of what bones and muscles need to recover. After a week, his body began to respond. His muscles firmed up, his joints stopped cracking, his stamina increased. Not from mana, from food, sleep, and training. An old-fashioned method, but it worked. On his days off, Tae Rin focused on 3 things. Training, searching for bones, and investigating. He trained in the morning on a vacant lot. Ji-eun trained with him. She was improving rapidly. Her grandfather's technique, stripped of any compensation for her injury, gave her gains she could never have dreamed of. A month after they met, she was a solid B rank. Unofficially. Officially, she was still a C rank. But Tae Rin could tell from her movements or her torso rotation, the speed of her strikes, that she was B rank. She could tell too, and for the first time in a long while, she stopped comparing herself to her grandfather. She was becoming her own person. Tae Rin conducted his search for bones systematically. The biomaterial dump yielded little, random fragments, unpredictable. Dungeons yielded more. But the bones there belonged mainly to monsters. Human remains are rare in dungeons. The bodies are usually retrieved, but not always. Over the course of a month, he found 6 more human fragments in dungeons of various ranks. The total count was 20 combat layers, 12 biomechanical ones. His body had adapted. His muscles had grown stronger from food and training. His actual combat effectiveness was approaching B rank. The system still classified him as E. The gap between his official rank and his actual strength was becoming dangerous. Too noticeable. The investigation was moving slowly. The notebook of the former Tae Rin contained 14 correlations between the disappearances of weak hunters and spikes in the strength of S-rank hunters, but correlations aren't proof. He needed bones, the bones of those who had disappeared. If he finds the bones of the missing hunters and reads them, he'll learn not only the techniques used, but also the circumstances of their deaths. Who killed them? When? Why? Bones don't lie. Bones are the most honest witnesses. The problem is that the bones are hidden in the foundations, in restricted zones, in places where he isn't allowed. Not yet. On the 32nd day, an encounter took place that changed the course of the investigation. Tae Rin was walking through the grounds of Seoul National University. He went there to the library. Scientific journals on archaeology and anthropology. Local ones, in Korean. He was studying what this world knew about bones and burials. Not much. Surprisingly little. All science in this world revolved around mana, dungeons, and the system. Bones were a byproduct. Trash. No one studied them seriously. He was leaving the library when he heard a scream. In English! A young woman was yelling at 2 men in association security uniforms. She was shouting that they had no right to confiscate her samples, that she had permission from the department, that this was academic research, not looting. The security guards remained unperturbed. One of them was holding a box. Judging by the sound, there was something fragile inside. Tae Rin stopped. He looked over. The girl was young, Korean, but not raised here. She had an American accent, dressed like a field researcher, pants with pockets, boots for excavations. Around her neck was a scarf with tassels sticking out, an archaeologist. He recognized one of his own. The girl noticed that someone was watching her. She turned toward him. She asked in Korean with a slight accent why he was standing there staring. If he was a witness, she told him to remember the license plate numbers of those 2 because she was going to file a complaint. Tae Rin approached. He looked at the box in the security guard's hands. He asked calmly what was in the box. The security guard replied that it was none of his business. Materials from the restricted zone, confiscated by order of the association. The girl flared up. She said these weren't materials from the restricted zone. They were soil samples from the perimeter. From the perimeter, not from the zone. She hadn't crossed the boundary. She'd taken the soil 2 meters from the fence. And this soil contained fragments she wanted to examine. Tae Rin looked at the box, then at the guards, then at the girl. He asked in English what kind of fragments they were. The girl froze. She switched to English. She replied that they were bone fragments, presumably human, from the soil near the restricted zone number 7, a Goryeo-era burial mound. Tae Rin felt something inside him fall into place, like a puzzle piece clicking into its designated slot. Bone fragments. Human, from the soil near the Goryeo-era burial mound. He turned to the guards. In a calm tone, he said in Korean that the confiscation of samples for academic research required a warrant from the association's scientific committee. Article 14, paragraph 3 of the Hunting Activities Act. Did they have a warrant? The guards exchanged glances. One of them took out his phone. He called someone. He spoke for a moment. He set the box down on a bench. He said he'd be back with a warrant and left with his partner. Tae Rin turned to the girl. She was staring at him with wide eyes. She asked how he knew about Article 14, paragraph 3. Tae Rin replied that he had read the entire law on his 3rd day in this world. He didn't say which world. The girl introduced herself. Ashley Park, a graduate student in the Department of Archaeology, an exchange program between Seoul National University and Columbia University, specializing in Goryeo period burials. She had arrived 6 months ago and had been trying ever since to gain access to restricted areas for scientific research. Without success, the association blocks everything, every request, every permit, every grant. She took samples from the perimeter because that's the only thing she can do without breaking the law, and even that, they're trying to take away from her. Tae Rin listened. Then he asked what exactly she had found in the soil. Ashley opened the box. Inside, in labeled plastic bags, lay fragments, small, dark. Tae Rin looked at them. Without touching them, he identified them by their shape and color. 2 of the fragments were human, phalanges, darkened by time, but not as much as they should have been after 800 years. These bones aren't from the Goryeo era. These bones are younger, 20 years old at most. He told Ashley this. She turned pale. She asked how he knew. He replied that it was based on the color and degree of mineralization. He explained it in English because in Korean didn't have the right terms. He said that bones age predictably, loss of collagen, changes in the crystalline structure. These fragments aren't 800 years old, 20 at most. Ashley sat down on a bench. She said quietly that if these bones were 20 years old, then they were from the first few years after the rift was discovered. Tae Rin nodded. He said that perhaps these were the bones of the first-generation hunters, those who went missing in 2005 or 2006. Ashley looked at him. She asked who he was. Tae Rin thought for a moment. He answered the same way he answered everyone. He said he was the one who read the bones. Ashley didn't laugh. She didn't raise an eyebrow. She was an archaeologist. She knew bones could be read. She did it herself. Only more slowly, and with equipment. She asked if he could determine more by touching the fragments. Tae Rin looked at the box, at the 2 small, darkened fragments, phalanges, an index finger. Someone's finger. Someone had stood there 20 years ago, breathing, and this finger had been part of a living hand. He reached out. He touched the first fragment. His ability kicked in. An Jung-sik, 29 years old, a C-rank hunter, one of the first. 2005, 2 months after the discovery of the first rift, a group of 12 people entered the forming dungeon beneath Seoul. Officially, it was a reconnaissance mission. Unofficially, it was a cleanup and sample collection operation on the orders of a man An Jung-sik knew as the chairman. The group found a chamber deep down. Inside the chamber were remains, ancient, millennia old. The bones glowed. Mana flowed from them like heat from embers. The chairman ordered them to collect everything. An Jung-sik obeyed. They collected the bones for 2 days. On the 3rd day, the chairman ordered the team to be eliminated. No witnesses were needed. An Jung-sik fled. He didn't make it. A blow to the back. His last thought, he stood on the ground at the exit from the underground chamber and looked up at the sky. The sky was blue. He thought the sky was beautiful. Then nothing. Tae Rin withdrew his hand. He was shaking. Not from fatigue, from rage. Quiet, professional. The kind he'd learned to control at the mass graves in Bosnia. When you hold a child's tibia with a gunshot wound in your hands and realize they were shot from above. The child was shot while someone stood over him. Ashley looked at his face. She asked what he'd seen. Tae Rin replied briefly. Name, date, circumstances, murder. On the orders of a man they called the chairman. 2005. Ashley took out her phone. She opened her notes. She said she was taking notes. Tae Rin dictated An Jung-sik, 29 years old, C rank, one of the first hunters, killed in 2005 on the orders of an unknown chairman following an operation to collect ancient remains. Ashley wrote it down. Then she looked up. She said she had access to the department's archives, databases, and scientific publications. A list of registered excavations in Korea over the past 30 years. If someone had conducted a large-scale operation in 2005 to extract remains from a forming underground realm, there must be a trace somewhere, a report, a permit, an invoice for equipment. People don't vanish without a trace. Tae Rin looked at her. He saw in her eyes what he recognized from the mirror. Professional obsession, a desire to get to the bottom of things, literally. He said he wanted to propose a collaboration, an academic one. She'd handle the documentation. He'd handle the fieldwork. Together, they'd cover both sides, science and practice, paperwork and bones. Ashley thought for 5 seconds. Then she held out her hand. She said she had one condition. Everything they found would be published under her name and his name, openly. No secret files. Tae Rin her hand. He said he had one condition too. Names first, then publications. Every dead person gets their name back first. Then they become a line in a scientific paper, not the other way around. Ashley nodded. She said that was the only right order. They exchanged numbers. Month 2. Tae Rin lived a double life. 2 days with Dong Hyuk's group, C-rank dungeons, money, experience, bones. 3 days spent on investigations and training. His body was changing. Proper food and daily workouts were taking their toll. His muscles had firmed up, his joints had strengthened, his endurance had doubled. He no longer gasped for breath after 10 minutes of combat. 20 layers of combat techniques were stored within him like a well-organized library. Each in its place, each summoned on demand. His response protocol was honed to the point of automatic reflex. The system still listed him as E rank. His actual level was B-, and the gap continued to grow. Ashley was working on another front. Over the course of 3 weeks, she had unearthed something important in the department's archives, a list of permits for geological surveys issued in 2005. 14 permits, all in the name of a company called First Dawn. The company was registered a month before the discovery of the first vault. It was dissolved a year later. The founders were hidden behind a chain of front men. But Ashley found one detail. First Dawn's registered address matched the address of the Monsoon Guild's current headquarters. Tae Rin read her report. He sat in his room staring at the 2 addresses, the same building, 20 years apart. The company that in 2005 sent teams into emerging dungeons to collect ancient remains and killed witnesses had become the Monsoon Guild. And the man whom An Jung-sik called chairman had become Guildmaster Jang Ewisop, the face of the nation. Number 1. Tae Rin closed the file. He opened his notebook. He wrote, "Connection established. First Dawn equals Musen. The chairman equals Jong Uiseop. The hypothesis is confirmed. The Muson Guild is built on bones. Literally, more evidence is needed. Bones from the foundation are needed." The next day, he met with Ashley at a coffee shop near campus. She arrived with a laptop and a stack of printouts. She spoke quickly, switching back and forth between Korean and English. She said she'd found something else. The construction company that built Muson's headquarters in 2007 went bankrupt a year after the project was completed. All the documents were destroyed. But one of the subcontractors is still alive. A foundation engineer. He lives in Incheon. He's retired. Tae Rin asked if she could set up a meeting. Ashley smiled. She said she'd already scheduled it for tomorrow. She told the engineer that she was writing a dissertation on construction techniques of the 2000s and that she needed an interview. The engineer agreed. Older people love it when young people take an interest in their work. Tae Rin looked at her. He thought that Ashley Park was the most helpful person he'd ever met in this world. The engineer's name was Bae Yon-hwan, 62 years old. He lived in a small apartment in Incheon. He opened the door. He saw Ashley with a voice recorder and Tae Rin with a notebook. He invited them inside. He offered them tea. He spoke willingly. The construction of the Muson headquarters, 2007, a big contract, good money. He was in charge of the foundation, a deep foundation, deeper than usual for a building of that size. The client insisted, said the soil was unstable. The engineer checked the soil. The soil was stable. Granite at a depth of 10 meters, as stable as it gets. But, the client insisted, they dug down to 20 meters. At 15 meters, they found a chamber, empty, or rather, almost empty. There were containers lying on the floor of the chamber, metal ones, sealed. The engineer didn't open them. It wasn't his business. But the workers saw people in uniforms without identification marks arrive at night. They loaded the containers onto a truck and drove them away. The next day, the pit was filled with concrete, 20 meters of it. The engineer asked the foreman why so much was needed. The foreman replied that the client wanted it that way. It wasn't his business. The engineer fell silent. Then he added quietly that a week after that, 2 of his workers went missing. The ones who had seen the containers. He filed a report with the police. The police found nothing. The case was closed. The engineer didn't press the matter. He had a family. A month later, the company went bankrupt. He was fired. Tae Rin was taking notes. Every word. Ashley was recording it on a voice recorder. When the engineer finished, Tae Rin asked one thing. He asked exactly how deep the camera was and what size the containers were. The engineer replied that the camera was at 15 meters, 2 by 3 meters. The containers were about 2 meters long, half a meter wide, half a meter tall, 4 of them. Tae Rin knew those dimensions. 2 meters by half a meter by half a meter. A standard container for transporting human remains. 4 containers. At least 4 bodies, maybe more if the bones were packed tightly together. They thanked the engineer. They left. Ashley remained silent until they reached the car. Then she got into the driver's seat and said quietly that it was a mass grave. Tae Rin nodded. He said it wasn't the first and wouldn't be the last. But now they had a witness. A living witness. Ashley started the car. She asked what to do next. Tae Rin replied that next they needed the bones. From the foundation, 20 meters of concrete without the containers they'd hauled away that night. But bones leave traces, microfragments, bone dust. Collagen in the soil. Even if the bodies were taken away, something remains. Something always remains. Ashley asked how he planned to get under the foundation of the headquarters of the country's largest guild. Tae Rin replied that he didn't know yet, but he knew who to ask. That evening, he called Dong Hyuk. He asked if Dong Hyuk knew any former Musan employees, anyone who'd left against their will. Dong Hyuk paused. Then he said he knew one person, Lee Sara, a former child prodigy from Baeko. Not Musan, but she knew people from Musan. She did, before she broke down. Tae Rin asked what broke down meant. Dong Hyuk explained briefly. A rank at 17, a star, the guild's hope, a disastrous cleanup mission at 18, 4 dead. She was blamed, she was fired. She's 19 now. She lives alone. She never leaves her apartment. Dong Hyuk gave the address. He said he'd tried to visit her. She wouldn't open the door. Tae Rin wrote down the address. Then he opened the second notebook, the one hidden under the floorboard. The notebook that belonged to the former Tae Rin. He flipped through it. He found it. An entry from 6 months ago. A failed B-rank dungeon run. The Baeko Guild. 4 dead. Names. He read the names. Then he looked at the wall. 4 of whose bones could he read if he found them? He could determine what happened in that dungeon. Who was to blame? Who wasn't? Bones don't lie. If Lee Sara broke down because she was accused of her comrades' deaths, then the bones of those comrades could tell the truth. He wrote it down in the notebook. Lee Sara, 19 years old. Former A rank. Baeko, potential witness in the Musan case. Approach. Not through force. Not through persuasion. Through the truth. If I find the bones of her comrades and read them, she'll get what no one else could give her. The answer to the question of whether she's guilty or not. And I'll gain an ally that no other guild has. The next day, he began his search. Not for Seru, for the bones of her comrades. The dungeon where they died had been officially sealed off after the incident, sealed by the association, access prohibited. But Tae Rin already knew that in this world, forbidden places are the very places where the truth lies. He called Ashley. He asked her to run a search through the databases for the dungeon's coordinates. Ashley found them within an hour, a suburb of Seoul, an industrial zone, a B-rank dungeon, closed after the incident. Status, inactive, 2 guard posts. Security cameras. Tae Rin looked at the coordinates. 2 guard posts, security cameras, an officially closed dungeon. To get in, you need either permission from the association or another way. He thought about it for a day. Then he found a solution, not a heroic one, a bureaucratic one. Ashley submitted a request on behalf of the Department of Archaeology to investigate inactive dungeons. An academic request, legal, through the scientific committee. The request takes 3 weeks to process. 3 weeks is a long time, but Tae Rin knew how to wait. In Bosnia, he'd waited half a year for permission to excavate. 3 weeks was nothing. While he waited, he did what he did best. He gathered data. He went into the dungeons with Dong Hyuk. He trained. He searched for bones. He wrote down names, 28 names in his notebook by the end of the 2nd month. 28 people whose stories he had read. 28 final moments in his mind. 28 debts. He'd already settled 3 of them. He found Park Seong-ho's family. His wife had given birth to a boy. The boy was 4 years old. Tae Rin went to see her. He introduced himself. He said he worked with the remains of hunters. He said her husband had died covering for a partner, that he hadn't chickened out, that he'd been thinking of her in his final moments. The woman cried. Then she thanked him. Then she cried again. Tae Rin sat beside her in silence. a notebook on his lap. In the promises column, a crossed-out line, done. The other 2 debts he'd settled were easier. Find Kim Yeonjin's family. Report back. Find Cho Min-hee's former partner. He survived. Works as a security guard at a parking lot. Former D rank. Drinks. Tae Rin went to see him. Told him that Min-hee had covered him until the very end, that her forearm had saved his life. The man listened. He remained silent. The request to enter the dungeon was approved 18 days later. Not because the association had become kinder, because Ashley had worded the request in such a way that a refusal would have looked worse than approval. Academic freedom, international exchange. Columbia University ensures that the rights of its graduate students are upheld. 3 lines in the request, written in English, with a copy sent to Columbia's registrar's office. The association gritted its teeth and issued the permit. Limited. 2 hours. 1 entry. A maximum of 3 people. No weapons, only tools for scientific research. Tae Rin read the conditions. 2 hours isn't much, but it's enough. He knew what to look for. He knew where to look, and he knew how to work quickly with the remains. In Rwanda, he'd sometimes have as little as 20 minutes for a full exhumation. 2 hours was a luxury. He took Ashley and Ji-geun with him. Ashley as the official researcher, Ji-geun as his assistant. She left her spear behind. Instead of a weapon, she took a shovel and a flashlight. The dungeon was in an industrial zone on the outskirts of Seoul. The entrance was barred with a metal grate. 2 association security guards checked their documents. They opened the grate. They started the timer. 2 hours. Inside, it was dark, dusty. The dungeon had been inactive for a year. The monsters were either dead or had gone deeper. Nothing on the first floor. Empty corridors. On the second floor, signs of a battle. Scratches on the walls. Dents in the floor. Brown stains. Old blood. Tae Rin walked quickly. He wasn't looking for signs of a battle. He was looking for bones. On the third floor, he found one. The first fragment in a crack in the wall. A rib, a small shard stuck between the stones. It hadn't been found during the evacuation of the bodies, or perhaps they hadn't looked for it. Tae Rin picked it up. His skill activated Ko Ji-hyun, 21 years old, B-rank Baiko Guild swordsman, one of the 4 who died in that incident. The final moment. The third floor of the dungeon. A group of 6. Lee Sa-ra in the lead, A-rank leader, the team behind her. Everything was going according to plan. Then the wall on the right exploded. It didn't just crack, it exploded. A creature emerged from it, one not listed in the intelligence reports. An A-rank creature in a B-rank dungeon. Impossible, but it was there. Ko Ji-hyun was standing closest to the wall. The blow struck before he could raise his sword, before anyone could react, before Lee Sa-ra could turn around. He died instantly. He didn't suffer. He didn't even have time to realize what was happening. The creature was already moving on to the next target. Lee Sa-ra turned around. She saw it. She shouted the order to retreat, but 2 were already dead. Ko Ji-hyun and Moon Tae Rin, both near the wall, both killed instantly. The third, Jang Byung-ho, ran. The creature caught up to him. The 4th, Park Yuri, stood between the creature and the retreating group. She bought Lee Sa-ra and the 5th member 5 seconds to live. Lee Sa-ra pulled the 5th member to safety. She went back for the rest, but there was no one left to return to. Tae Rin dropped the bone. His hands were shaking, but not from grief, from rage. An A-rank creature in a B-rank dungeon. This was no accident. It was either an assessment error that someone made intentionally or a setup. Someone had placed an A-rank creature in a B-rank dungeon and sent the group there. He continued his search. In an hour and a half, he found 3 more fragments, each from one of the 4. Each told the same story from a different perspective. Moon Tae-hyun, 23, saw the wall crack half a second before the explosion. She had time to think that something was wrong. She didn't have time to scream. Jang Byung-ho, 20, ran, not out of cowardice, out of instinct. He ran toward the exit to call for backup. He was the team's communications officer. His job was to run and call for help. He was doing his job. He didn't make it. Park Yuri, 22 years old. She knew she was going to die. She stood up, raised her shield, gave them 5 seconds. Her last thought. Sa-ra, run! I've got this. 4 fragments. 4 stories. 1 truth. Lee Sa-ra is not to blame. She couldn't give the order they demanded because the creature struck before any order could be uttered. Less than a second passed between the wall's explosion and the deaths of the first two. Human reaction time doesn't work in less than a second. No order would have saved Ko Ji-hyun and Moon Tae-rin. None. Lee Sa-ra did the only thing she could do. She pulled out whoever she could. She went back for the rest. She was too late, through no fault of her own. Tae-rin emerged from the dungeon 4 minutes before the allotted time ran out. Ashley was walking beside him. Pale, she hadn't seen the readings, but she saw his face. That was enough. Ji-un was carrying a bag with the fragments. Silently, the guards checked the time. They closed the grate. Tae Rin sat down on the curb by the entrance. He took out his notebook. He wrote down 4 names, 4 stories, 4 sets of circumstances, and at the bottom, a single line. Lee Sa-ra is innocent, an A-rank creature in a B-rank dungeon, presumably a setup. Who stands to gain? That evening, he drove to the address Dong Hyuk had given him, a small apartment complex in a residential neighborhood. 3rd floor. Door number 304. He rang the bell. Silence. He rang it again. Silence. He sat down on the floor by the door. He took out his notebook. He began to speak, not loudly, calmly, through the door. He said his name was Moon Tae Rin, that he wasn't from the guild, not from the association, not a journalist. He's the one who reads bones. He was in the dungeon where her comrades died. He found them. Ko Ji-hyun, Moon Tae-hyun, Jang Byung-ho, Park Yuri. He knows what happened. Not from reports, not from testimonies. From the bones. Bones don't lie. And the bones say she's innocent. The silence behind the door changed. It became different. Someone was listening. Tae Rin continued. He said the creature struck from the wall, without warning. Less than a second passed between the explosion and the deaths of the first 2. Human reaction time doesn't allow for giving an order in less than a second. She wasn't late with the order. The order was impossible. Physically. Biomechanically, she did everything she could. She pulled out the survivor. She went back for the dead. She didn't make it in time, through no fault of her own. The lock clicked. The door swung open, held only by the chain. Through the crack, an eye. One. Dark. Red from tears that had been falling for a long time. Maybe an hour. Maybe a year. The voice was hoarse. Quiet. She asked how he knew about the wall. It wasn't in the report. The report said the creature had entered through the hallway. Tae Rin replied that the report was lying. The creature had entered through the wall. He'd seen the cracks. He'd seen the direction of the impact from the damage to Ko Ji-hyo's ribs. The blow came from the side and below, from the wall, not from the hallway. If the creature had come down the hallway, the blow would have come from the front. Sa-ra closed the door. Tae Rin waited. A minute later, the door swung wide open. Lee Sa-ra stood in the doorway, thin, pale, wearing a crumpled t-shirt, her hair tied up. 19 years old. She looked 30. She said one sentence. She said that if he was lying, she'd kill him right there. Tae Rin nodded. He took 4 plastic bags containing fragments out of his pocket. He placed them on the floor in front of her. He said these were the ones. Ko Ji-hyun, Moon Tae-hyun, Jang Byung-ho, Park Yuri. Let her decide what to do with them. He didn't take them. He didn't master the techniques. These weren't his dead. They were hers. Sa-ra sank to her knees. She picked up one bag, pressed it to her chest, and began to cry. Not quietly, not gracefully, terrifyingly. The way people cry when they've held it inside for a year and finally let it go. Tae Rin sat next to her on the floor in the hallway and remained silent. He knew how to be silent in the face of grief. He'd learned it in Bosnia. 20 minutes. Then Sa-ra raised her head. She wiped her face with her sleeve. She looked at him with reddened eyes. She asked what he wanted. Tae Rin replied that he wanted nothing. He'd come to return the bones to their comrades. That was his job. If she ever wanted to talk about what she knew regarding the guild, he'd be happy to listen. But that wasn't a condition. She'd get the bones unconditionally. Sa-ra looked at him for a long time. Then she said that the creature in that dungeon hadn't appeared by chance. A week before the cleanup, she'd overheard a conversation. 2 senior members from Baekho, were talking about a contract with Muson, about some kind of service, about a dungeon that needed to be shut down with a bang, so there'd be a reason to seal the entrance and never open it again. She didn't understand it then. She understood later, when 4 of her comrades lay dead and she was accused of negligence. The dungeon was sealed off. That was precisely the goal. Something in that dungeon needed to be hidden. The 4 who died were the price of sealing it off. Tae Rin recorded it, every word. Then he asked one thing. He asked what exactly had been in that dungeon before the creature was placed there. Sarah replied that she didn't know, but she knew who did. Moon Tae Rin. She was the team's scout. She went in first. She saw what was inside before the sweep began. Tae Rin looked at the package containing Moon Tae Rin's fragment. He had already read it. He had seen the final moment, the wall, the explosion, death. But he hadn't looked for it before. He hadn't looked any deeper. Reading the fragment automatically revealed the final moment. But if he concentrated, if he dug deeper, like a full skeletal analysis, maybe he could see more. He asked Sarah if he could try. Sarah nodded. Tae Rin took the fragment of Moon Tae Rin. He closed his eyes. He concentrated, not on the final moment, on the penultimate one, on what happened before the fight. He dug deeper than ever before. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His temples throbbed. The layers of voices stirred inside him. The 28 residents in his head turned at the same time. He held them in place, with a notepad, with names each in their own place. Quiet. I'm working. And I saw her. Moon Tae Rin, 2 hours before the fight. The first floor of the dungeon. She's walking down the corridor. A lantern. Silence. The dungeon is empty. No monsters. Not a single one. That's strange. A B-rank dungeon should be teeming with creatures, but it's empty. She reaches the 3rd floor, a large chamber, and inside the chamber are containers, metal ones, sealed, 4 of them, 2 meters by half a meter by half a meter. She opens one. Inside are bones, human bones, lots of them, neatly stacked. She's not an anthropologist. She doesn't understand what she's seeing, but she knows something's wrong. She goes out. She reports to Sarah. Sarah calls base. Base responds, continue the sweep. What containers? There are no containers. Continue. An hour later, the wall explodes. Tae Rin opened his eyes. He looked at Sarah. He said 2 words. The same containers, the 3rd month. Tae Rin's team had taken shape, not a guild, not a clan, something else. Jiyeon was on the front lines. Ashley was in the archives. Yuna kept track of everyone's health. Sarah hadn't left the apartment yet, but she'd started answering calls. She'd started eating. She'd started thinking about something other than guilt. Dong-hyuk and his group provided funding and cover. Her uncle was drinking less, not because he'd reformed, because there was more money, and the reason to drink out of despair had disappeared. Tae Rin was working every day, no days off, dungeons with Dong-hyuk, morning training sessions, investigations in the evening. The notebook was filling up, 34 names, 34 layers. His body was holding up. The anatomical map of distribution was working. Every tenant in its place. Everyone stays silent until called upon. But at night, it got harder. He'd wake up and not immediately realize who he was. A second, 2, 3. Then he'd find himself. Moon Tae Rin, Chicago, anthropologist, right. But those 3 seconds were getting longer. In the middle of the 3rd month, what he'd been waiting for and fearing happened. A forced fight. Not in the dungeon, on the street. He was returning with Ji-eun from a D-rank dungeon. Evening, an alley near the subway station. 3 men, no uniforms, no badges, but armed. 1 with a sword, 2 with knives, professionals, C rank, maybe higher. They were waiting specifically for him. The first one stepped forward. He said there were people who wanted to talk. He asked them to come along willingly. Ji-eun pulled a spear from behind her back, faster than he could finish speaking. She stood between them and Tae Rin. She told them to come closer. The swordsman looked at her. He sized her up. He wasn't impressed. Officially C rank, against 3 C ranks or higher, the odds weren't in her favor. He attacked, quickly, professionally. The sword swept in an arc toward her throat. Ji-eun parried with her spear. The shaft held firm. The tip flashed. A counterattack, straight on. No arc, no compensation for the opponent's injury. The swordsman barely dodged. Surprise flashed across his face. A C rank doesn't strike like that. A P rank does. The 2 men with knives moved to flank her, toward Tae Rin. He was standing against the wall, a dagger in his hand, his body tense, 34 layers ready, protocol active. The first dagger wielder struck from the right, a low blow, to the thigh. Kim Yun-jin dodged, down and to the left. The dagger whizzed past. Counterattack, a slashing strike by Park Seong-ho, not at the body, at the arm. The dagger sliced through the forearm. The attacker recoiled. The second attacked from behind. Wang Jai-ho's spatial awareness kicked in a second before the strike. Tae Rin spun around. Cho Min-hee blocked the blow. His forearm met the blade flat. It hurt, but the bone was intact. A counterattack, not aimed at him. At Oh Jin-soo, a takedown. Feet planted on the asphalt. A full-body shove. The attacker flew into the wall. The first knife wielder returned. His hand was bleeding but still functional. He struck again. Faster this time. A flurry. 3 strikes. Tae Rin retreated. His E-rank body couldn't keep up. His muscles were burning. His breath was ragged. He had the technique, but not the stamina. Yet he didn't need to win. He just needed to hold out. Ji-eun finished off the swordsman in 40 seconds. A piercing crane strike to the thigh. The swordsman fell, not dead, won't get up. She turned to face the dagger wielders. Her spear traced an arc. The first dagger wielder was struck in the temple by the shaft. The second one saw the spear and ran. Ji-eun didn't chase after him. She turned to Tae Rin. He was standing by the wall. His hands were shaking. A cut on his forearm was bleeding. Not deep, but it was bleeding. Ji-eun walked over. She examined the cut. She took a bandage out of her backpack. She bandaged it in silence. Then she said one thing. She told him that next time he should stand behind her, not beside her. Tae Rin nodded. Then he looked at the swordsman lying on the asphalt. He walked over and crouched down beside him. The swordsman was conscious. He looked up at Tae Rin from below. Tae Rin asked who had sent him. The swordsman remained silent. Tae Rin placed a hand on his shoulder. The skill activated. Not on a dead bone, on a living one. Different information came through, not at the last moment, not a name, a body. He read the swordsman's body like an X-ray. Old fractures, typical of a Muson fighter. The right-hand technique matched the Muson martial school. Specific wear and tear on the shoulder joint from repetitive strikes, characteristic of the Golden Dragon style. Tae Rin removed his hand. He told the swordsman that he knew where he was from. Muson Golden Dragon style, 3rd or 4th Dan, a fracture in his right wrist 3 years ago. It hadn't healed properly. That's why the strike comes with a twist. The swordsman turned pale. Tae Rin stood up. He said to tell whoever sent you that the bone doctor reads not only the dead, the living too. They left. On the way, Tae Rin called Dong Hyuk. He gave him a brief account. Dong Hyuk cursed. He said that Muson had moved from recruitment to intimidation. That meant Tae Rin had become prominent enough to be a nuisance. They needed to speed things up or slow down. Tae Rin replied that he wouldn't be slowing down. The next day, he gathered everyone at the quiet stream dorm. Ji-eun, Yoon-woo. Ashley came from campus. Dong Hyuk came alone without his team, and Sa-ra joined via speakerphone. For the first time, everyone was in the same room, virtually. Tae Rin laid out his notes on the table. 2 notebooks, a map marked with restricted zones, Ashley's printouts, engineer Bae Yeon-hwan's testimony, the scan results, and 34 names. He spoke for 40 minutes. He laid everything out. The First Dawn Company, the Monsoon Guild, containers under the Foundation, containers in the sealed dungeon, the murder of An Jong-sik in 2005, planting an A-rank creature to seal off the Baeko dungeon, the 4 fallen comrades of Sa-ra, and most importantly, the bones. Dozens, or perhaps hundreds of first-generation hunters, killed for their power, hidden under concrete, reported missing. When he finished, the room was silent. Yuna sat with a stony expression. Ji-eun gripped her spear so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Ashley was scribbling in her notebook. Dong Hyuk stared at the table. Silence from the phone. Then Sarah's voice. Quiet. Steady. She said she was ready, that she'd leave the apartment. That if they needed heavy artillery, she was the heavy artillery. Let him tell her when. Dong Hyuk looked up. He said his team was on the case, all 5 of them. Ashley said she needed a week to put everything into an academic format that couldn't be ignored. Yuna didn't say anything. She just stood up and started making tea. For all 6 of them. Tae Rin looked at them. At each one. This isn't the army, it isn't a guild, it's a small lab, everyone in their place. Intelligence, medicine, science, law, combat support, a kitchen, everything they needed. He opened his notebook. He wrote a new title, Mungwang, The Door and the Light. A working title. The 4th month, Tae Rin moved into the active phase. Restricted Zone Number 7, a Goryeo-era burial mound. The place where Ashley took soil samples. The place where the fragment of Anjong-sik lay. There was no official permission. There won't be any. The association won't grant access to the restricted zone voluntarily. So, unofficially. Night, Tae Rin, Ji-eun, Sarah. It was Sarah's first time on a mission. She looked different from that broken person standing in the doorway a month ago. Still thin, still pale, but her eyes were different. Something was burning in them again. Not the fire of an A-rang, the fire of a person who wants the truth. She moved silently, professionally. Her body remembered. Her muscles remembered. A rank doesn't disappear after a year of inactivity. It goes into hibernation. Sarah was waking up, 2 guard posts at the restricted zone. 4 people, C rank, cameras, monosensors. Serious business, but not for an A rank. Sarah disabled the sensors in 30 seconds. A monopulse. Precise. Brief. The sensors detected the spike and rebooted. A 90-second window. They made it through. The burial mound was large, an earthen mound covered with grass and trees, empty inside. Tae Rin could feel it. The earth was humming, not from mana, from memory. The ancients lay here, very ancient ones, and lying beside them were those who had been brought here 20 years ago. He began to dig. Ashley had taught him how to use a ground-penetrating radar, a portable one, compact. It showed the soil structure down to a depth of 5 meters. That was enough. At a depth of 2 meters, the ground-penetrating radar detected a cavity, a small one, 1 meter by 1 meter. Tae Rin dug for 30 minutes. Ji-eun helped. Sarah stood guard. The cavity turned out to be a niche dug into the clay. Inside were bones. Not ancient. Modern, 20 years old, maybe younger, 3 skulls, fragments of long bones, ribs, vertebrae, 3 people. Tae Rin worked quickly. Every touch was a reading. Every reading revealed a name. The first, Kang Min-woo, 25 years old, C rank, 2006, a first-generation hunter, killed after an operation to extract ancient remains from beneath Seoul. The same handwriting. The same order, the same chairman. The second, Choi Eun-bi, 30 years old, B rank, 2006. She was an archaeologist before she became a hunter. She was recruited into the team because she knew how to handle the remains. When the job was done, they got rid of her. One last thought, she knew they would kill her. She hid her notebook somewhere here in the burial mound. Tae Rin froze. The notebook, tangible evidence, not a bone. Paper. He began to search. Not around the body, further away. Choi Eun-bi was an archaeologist. She knew how to hide things in the ground. 20 minutes. Sarah, standing at the entrance, hissed that a patrol had passed 200 meters away. Time was running out. Tae Rin dug with his fingers, just like at an excavation site, layer by layer, and he found it. A metal container the size of a pencil case. Sealed, rusty, but intact. Inside was a plastic bag. Inside the bag was a notebook, a small one. Soaked at the edges, but still legible. Tae Rin didn't read it right there. He put it in his backpack. The third skull. Bae Seong-jin, 27 years old, C rank, 2006, nothing new. The same handwriting, the same order. Killed, hidden, forgotten. They left an hour before dawn. The sensors had reset long ago, but they left no traces. Ashley had taught them. In the morning, Tae Rin sat in his room reading Choi Eun-bi's notebook. The handwriting was small, hasty, dates, names, coordinates. She had kept a record of everything they found in the dungeons in 2005 and 2006. Ancient bones, dragon spines, the remains of warriors from the Three Kingdoms era. All of it had been recovered. They sorted it, distributed it among the 5 guilds. The Big 5, Monsoon, Baiko, Cheong Ryeon, Gayonggang, Hansong, Each received its share. The agreement was signed in November 2005. The document was called the First Dawn Agreement, and in the notebook was a detail that changed everything. They didn't just take the bones, they used them. The guildmasters and their closest allies performed an absorption ritual, the same principle as Tae Rin's skill, only crude, without understanding, without the consent of the dead, without names. They simply took the power in bulk. Korea's 5 strongest hunters became our ranks, not through training or dungeons, through the bones of the dead, through the murder of those who found those bones, and through 20 years of silence. Tae Rin closed the notebook. He set it on the table. He looked at the wall. Hanging there was a promotional poster of Yang Uisop, Defender of the Nation, number 1, S rank. A man whose power belonged to the dead, whose names had been erased. He took out his phone. He called Ashley, then Rachel Cho, a lawyer, a Korean woman from Los Angeles, a specialist in international humanitarian law. Rachel had arrived in Korea 2 months ago. Her mother was dying, cancer, her final weeks. Rachel had taken a leave of absence and flown in. Tae Rin had tracked her down through Ashley, Columbia University, Law School of Law. Former colleagues. Rachel specialized in genocide tribunals, 10 years of experience, The Hague, Rwanda, Cambodia. She knew how to handle cases involving mass graves, how to conduct exhumations according to international standards, how to bring to trial what everyone turns a blind eye to. They met at a coffee shop. Rachel was precise, cold, businesslike. She listened to everything in 40 minutes. She looked at Choi Eunbi's notebook. She looked at Tae Rin's notes. Then she said this was the case, the real case, not for a Korean court, for an international. Mass murders, concealment of remains, falsification of reports, elimination of witnesses, usurpation of power through the illegal appropriation of remains. She put it elegantly. She said that in legal terms it's called desecration and misappropriation. Tae Rin said that in his language it's called something simpler. Theft of names. Rachel nodded. She said she needed 3 things, the victims' names, the suspects' names, and the bones. Tae Rin replied that he had the first 2. He'd get the third. Rachel looked at him. She said that in 10 years on the job, she'd never once seen an expert witness who found the evidence himself, examined it himself, and put together the case himself. Usually, those are 3 different people. Tae Rin shrugged. He said he was saving the budget. Rachel almost smiled. The 5th month. Everything had picked up speed. Tae Rin conducted nightly raids into restricted zones every week. Sara secured their passage through security. Ji-yeon carried the equipment. Ashley documented everything. In 1 month, he had covered 4 of the 12 officially registered restricted zones. In each, he found remains. First-generation hunters. Those who'd been disposed of after the job was done. The names kept piling up. 48, 63, 91, 114. Every night he returned with new names. Every night he wrote them down. Every morning he woke up for a second longer than the day before, not understanding who he was. The layering intensified, not from combat techniques. He stopped absorbing techniques after the 30th layer. Enough. His body couldn't hold any more without risk. From their final moments, from the deaths of others, 114 deaths in his head, 114 final thoughts, 114 faces that the dying saw in their last moment. Wives, husbands, children, mothers, the sky. He kept records every evening. A roll call, name by name. That kept him going, for now. Rachel worked in parallel. She compiled the case file. She documented the testimonies. She translated Tae Rin's notes into legal language. She contacted The Hague, unofficially, through former colleagues. She asked, hypothetically, whether it would be possible to bring a case regarding the mass murder of hunters in a jurisdiction that did not exist at the time the International Criminal Court was established. She was told that there were no precedents, but that it was theoretically possible if the evidence were irrefutable. Ashley published her first article, an academic one, in the department's journal, a modest, on the results of soil research near the restricted zones. Not a word about the murders, just data, collagen content in the soil, mineralization of bone fragments, age of the remains. In scientific terms, she said one thing. Human remains dating back 20 years are found in the soil near the restricted zones. The article went unnoticed by the general public, but not by the association. The day after publication, a man arrived at the Quiet Stream dormitory. Not a recruiter, not a militant, a man in an expensive coat, graying temples, a calm face. The security detail stayed in the car, 4 of them, all S rank, judging by the aura that pressed down even through the walls. Chan Yisop, Guildmaster Musen, defender of the nation. Number 1. He walked into the dormitory as if entering his own home, without knocking. He sat down at a table in the common room. He asked for tea. The uncle jumped to his feet. He began fussing about. His hands were shaking, not from alcohol, from fear. An S rank in their dormitory was like the president in a village hut. Tae Rin came down from upstairs. He saw Yisop. He sat down across from him. Yisop looked at him. He smiled warmly, like a father. He said they were finally meeting in person, that he'd heard a lot about him, that he was impressed. A young man with a unique talent, a rarity. Tae Rin remained silent. He waited. Uisop spoke gently. He said he understood his ambitions, that he too had been young, that he too had started from scratch. 20 years ago, the world was on the brink. Fractures, chaos, panic. Someone had to take control. Whoever had to make tough decisions. He made them. Not because he wanted to, because there was no one else. Hundreds of lives in exchange for millions saved. The math of war. He isn't asking for forgiveness. He's explaining. Then he leaned forward. He said quietly that Tae Rin could join him. That together they could make the system better from the inside. That exposing the truth wouldn't destroy the guilds. It would destroy the hunter industry itself. It would leave the country defenseless against the dungeons. Millions of people would become vulnerable. For what? For the sake of the names of the dead who no longer care. Tae Rin listened. Then he said one thing. He asked Uisop if he remembered the name An Jong-sik. Uisop blinked. He paused. Then he said he didn't remember. Tae Rin nodded. He said that was the difference between them. Uisop erased names. Tae Rin wrote them down. Uisop looked at him. The smile hadn't faded, but it had changed. It was cold. He stood up. He straightened his coat. He said he was giving him a week. In a week, the offer would expire. And then a different conversation would begin. He left. Security escorted him out. His uncle sat at the table. Pale. His hands were shaking. Tae Rin went up to his room. He took out his phone. He called everyone. A meeting in an hour, at Kim Na-yeon's, in the dining room. It was the first time he'd brought everyone to Na-yeon's. A small Ho-sik chip in the old neighborhood, warm lighting, the smell of broth. Na-yeon didn't ask why 6 people with serious expressions had come. She put the kettle on. She started cooking. Tae Rin told them about Uisop's visit. 1 week. After that, war. Rachel said the case was 80% complete. We need another 20. We need a public gesture, something that will make it impossible to sweep the matter under the rug. Ashley said she could organize a press conference through the department, the auditorium at Seoul National University, campus grounds, under the university's jurisdiction, not the association's. The guilds cannot enter the university grounds without the president's permission. The president won't grant it. He has his own score to settle with the association. Sarah said she would stand guard at the door. If anyone tries to force their way in, she's ready to fight back. She wasn't smiling when she said that, but there was something in her voice that wasn't there a month ago. Confidence. Ji-eun said she'd stand right beside her with a spear. Yuna said she'd keep an eye on Tae Rin's blood pressure. It's been all over the place this past week. 114 strangers' deaths in your head. That's no joke. Na-yeon silently placed a bowl of soup in front of each person, without asking, without discussing it. She just set them down. The soup was hot, thick, with homemade noodles and beef. Tae Rin took a sip. He froze. He looked at Na-yeon. She was standing at the stove and wasn't looking at him. But her hands moved the way the hands of someone who knows they're feeding people before a difficult day move. He thought about what he hadn't told her. He hadn't told her that he'd found her husband's bones 2 months ago. In restricted zone number 3. He hadn't told her because it wasn't the right time, because every day was taken up with the investigation, because he's a coward when it comes to the living. He can handle the dead, but not the living. But the time had come. After dinner, when everyone had left and the dining hall was empty and Nayeon was washing the dishes, Tae Rin stayed behind. He sat at the table. He was silent. Nayeon dried her hands. She looked at him. She asked if he wanted seconds. Tae Rin took a container out of his backpack. A small one. Plastic. He set it on the table. Next to it was a note, the date, the place, the circumstances. Nayeon looked at the container, at the note, then at Tae Rin. He said it was her husband, Park Tae-hyun. He died 8 years ago, not in the underground, in the restricted zone. He'd been sent there to collect samples. He didn't come back because they wouldn't let him. He didn't chicken out. He didn't run away. He was killed. And now his bones are at home. Nayeon stood there. She looked. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. Then she slowly walked over to the stove. She poured some soup into a separate bowl. She set it in front of the empty chair next to Tae Rin, the chair that no one had sat in for 8 years. Then she sat down across from it. The three of them sat there, Tae Rin, Nayeon, an empty chair with a bowl of soup, in silence, for a long time. It was the quietest and most important moment of the entire 5 months. The day of the press conference, the 6th month, the auditorium at Seoul National University, morning. Tae Rin arrived 2 hours before it began, wearing a plain white shirt, a notebook in his hand, that very one, the first one, worn and tattered. Over 200 pages filled with his handwriting, a name on every page. The auditorium was large, 300 seats. Ashley had arranged the invitations, the press, the academic community, foreign correspondents, 3 TV channels, 2 bloggers with an audience of 1 million, and representatives of the families of the missing hunters. 32 people who had responded to the letters Ashley and Nayeon had been sending out for 2 weeks. 32 people who had been waiting 20 years for an answer. Rachel flew in from Incheon on the morning flight. She had spent the night at her mother's bedside. She was fading away, days, maybe hours. Rachel kissed her on the forehead. She said she'd be back in the evening. Her mother squeezed her hand. She said one word, go. Rachel arrived at the university with a folder. Inside the folder was the case file, 200 pages, in Korean and English, a copy in The Hague, a copy at the International Association of Forensic Anthropologists, a copy at the UN Human Rights Committee, 3 copies that could no longer be destroyed. Sarin stood at the entrance to the hall, a black jacket, hands in her pockets. She hadn't brought a weapon. She didn't need a weapon. She was the weapon, a rank. She had slept for a year and awakened. Over the past month, she had trained daily, not for strength, for control. She was no longer afraid of her power. She was afraid of her guilt, and the guilt was gone. Tae Rin had taken her guilt away. He had given her the truth, and the truth turned out to be lighter. Ji-un stood inside the hall, by the table. A spear leaned against the wall behind a curtain, within arm's reach. She wasn't smiling. She was scanning everyone who entered. Her skills had improved so much over the past 5 months that she could pass a B rank test without a second thought, maybe even an A. She hadn't checked. It didn't matter. What mattered was that Tae Rin finish reading his notebook. Yuna was sitting in the front row. A first aid kit was under her chair. She'd checked Tae Rin's blood pressure that morning. It was high. His pulse was rapid. 114 other people's deaths in his head were taking their toll. She gave him a pill. He swallowed it. He looked at her. She looked at him. Not a word. Everything had been said. Nayeon came in with a thermos. Tea, green tea, hot. She set it down in front of the microphone. She placed a napkin next to it. Tae Rin looked at the thermos, then at Nayeon. She nodded, turned around, went into the auditorium, sat down in the 3rd row, next to a woman Tae Rin didn't know. Nayeon knew her. She'd sent the letters out personally. She found the families, every single one by one. 32 replies out of the 114 letters sent. The rest either didn't receive them or were too afraid. 32 is enough. 32 is 32 people who came to the auditorium to hear the name they'd been waiting for 20 years. Ashley stood by the projector. On the screen was the Department of Archaeology's logo. Below it was the title, Preliminary Results of the Investigation into Unidentified Remains Near Historically Unstable Zones in the Republic of Korea. Dry, academic, safe. What would be said over the next 2 hours would be anything but safe. At 9:45, the auditorium was full. The cameras were rolling, live broadcast, 3 channels, 2 streams. Ashley checked to make sure the broadcast was going through servers in 3 countries. Rachel had secured legal cover by classifying the event as an international academic event. The broadcast could be shut down, but that would take time, enough time. At 10 o'clock sharp, Tae Rin sat down at the table in front of the microphone. He set down his notebook, opened the first page, looked out at the audience. Cameras, journalists, scientists, and 32 people in different rows, all sitting with the same expression on their faces, hope and fear at the same time. Tae Rin poured himself some tea from Nayeon's thermos, took a sip, then he began to speak. He said that his name was Moon Tae Rin, that his specialty was the identification of remains, that over the past 5 months he had examined 114 bone fragments found in the soil near restricted zones and in sealed underground chambers, that each fragment belonged to a specific person, that every person had a name. That he would now read those names. The room fell silent. He began to read. An Jong-sik, 29 years old, C rank, killed in 2005. Location of remains, restricted zone number 7. Circumstances of death, violent death by order of the operations leadership. Kang Min-woo, 25 years old. C rank, 2006, same zone, same circumstances. Choi Eun-bi, 30 years old, B rank. Archaeologist, 2006, killed after the completion of an operation to recover ancient remains. Name after name, date after date. Tae Rin's voice was even, calm, professional, just like during a lab report. No drama, no accusations, just the facts. Name, age, rank, date of death, place of discovery, circumstances. By the 20th name, a woman in the hall began to cry. Quietly, she pressed her hand to her face. Her daughter sat next to her and held her other hand. By the 30th name, the journalist stopped taking notes and began to listen. By the 50th, one of the cameramen wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and continued filming. Tae Rin was reading an hour and a half. 2 hours, his voice didn't waver, his hands didn't tremble. Yuna, in the front row, monitored his heart rate on her wrist monitor. 120, 130, 140, high, but tolerable. She knew he would finish reading, because he wasn't the type to leave things half done. She'd realized that during the first week, an hour before the end, it grew noisy outside the hall doors. Voices, demands to open the doors. Muson's people. Sarah stood by the door, calm. Hands in her pockets. One of Muson's people tried to enter. Sarah didn't even take her hands out of her pockets. She looked at him. A surge of mana, invisible. The man stopped dead in his tracks. He turned pale. He turned around, he left. An A rank who's just woken up after a year of hibernation isn't messing around. Even an S rank would think twice. Tae Rin continued, name after name. 112th, 113th. Park Taehwan, 31 years old. D rank, hunter, husband of Kim Nayeon. Sent to restricted zone number 3 to collect samples 8 years ago. Killed on the spot, body buried in the ground near the zone's entrance, remains handed over to the family. In the 3rd row, Nayeon sat upright. She wasn't crying, she was looking at Tae Rin. She held a thermos on her lap. She had already received his remains. She already knew. But hearing her husband's name in this hall, in front of the cameras, and 32 people who understood, was different. It was official. It was forever. The 114th name. The last one. Tae Rin paused. He looked at the page. Then he raised his head. He looked out into the hall. The last name. Moon Tae Rin. 23 years old. E rank. Hunter of the Quiet Stream Clan. Killed on March 14th on the orders of the Hunters Association for Journalistic Activities. The body was left at the entrance to the F-rank dungeon, disguised as an accident. He paused. The hall was silent. In the front row, So-yoon stood up, slowly. She walked over to the microphone, set up for questions from the audience. She turned it on. Her hands were burned, her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. She said, "This is my brother." Then she paused. Then she added, "Thank you for bringing him back." The hall remained silent for another 3 seconds. Then a sound, not applause, not a shout. A collective sigh. 300 people exhaled at the same time. And at that moment, the cameras captured something that no PR department could ever deny. Faces. 32 faces of people who'd waited 20 years and finally heard the news. The broadcast was live. 3 channels, 2 streams, servers in 3 countries. Monsoon didn't manage to shut it down. Baeko didn't manage to shut it down. The association didn't manage to shut it down. Rachel stood up. She walked over to the table. She placed the folder next to Tae Rin's notebook. She said into the microphone that the case had been referred to the International Criminal Court and the UN Human Rights Committee, that copies were on file with 3 international organizations, that the physical evidence was being stored outside the jurisdiction of the Hunters Association, that any attempt to destroy the evidence would automatically be classified as obstruction of international justice. Then she repeated the same information in English for the foreign correspondents. Tae Rin was sitting at the table. His notebook was open to the last page. 114 names. Each one had been spoken. Each one had been heard. Each one had been recorded by the cameras. He closed the notebook. He poured himself some tea. His hands were finally trembling. Yuna approached. She checked his pulse. 150. She shook her head. She said quietly that he needed to lie down. Tae Rin replied that he would soon. Just 1 more minute. He looked into the room. Ji-eun was by the wall. The spear was behind the curtain. She was smiling. For the first time that day. Ashley was by the projector, phone in her hands, typing something, probably Twitter, probably with emojis, much to Rachel's horror. Sarah was by the door, hands in her pockets. It was quiet outside the door. They'd left. Na-yeon was in the 3rd row, an empty chair next to her, but on her lap was a thermos from which Tae Rin had been drinking for 2 hours. She'd been feeding him here too. Dong-hyuk was in the back row. He sat there in silence. There were tears in his eyes. A B rank, a man who'd worked with S ranks for 10 years and never once asked where their power came from. Now he knew, and he was crying. Tae Rin stood up from the table, a notepad tucked under his arm. He headed for the exit. Halfway there, he stopped. He turned toward the hall. He said one last thing. He said he wasn't a hero, not a fighter, not a revolutionary. He was a specialist in remains. He was just doing his job. It was just that his work had landed in a world that wasn't ready for it. He walked out. In the hallway, Yuna was walking beside him. She was watching his every step. His gait was unsteady. He was exhausted. 114 names in 2 hours. That's more than an E rank can handle. Even an E rank with 30 combat layers. Even an E rank whose body is home to the voices of dozens of the dead. Ji-eun walked behind him, her spear on her back, guarding him. As always, they stepped out onto the street. Seoul, evening, lights. The security poles flickered blue. On the billboard across the street was the face of Chung Ui-sop, defender of the nation. Number 1. Someone had already stuck a sticker over it, printed in a hurry, 1 word in large letters, bones. Tae Rin looked at the sticker, then at the sky. No stars were visible, as always. Too much light, but they're there. Behind the billboards and the flickering runes and the smoke of the dungeons. They're there. He opened his notebook. On the last page, after the 114th name, there was still space left. He wrote, "The case is open. The names have been returned. The work continues." He closed the notebook, put it in his backpack. He walked on. Na-yeon was waiting in the dining hall. The soup was hot. A chair was free. That very one. Next to the empty chair with a plate on it. 2 plates on 2 chairs. 1 for the living. 1 for the dead. And both in their places.